What if the first chapter of human history isn't the beginning at all, but the midpoint of a story far older than the ground beneath our feet? What if the myths we were taught to treat as symbolic, gods descending from the sky, oceans swallowing continents, tablets carved before the first human cities, were never metaphors, but memories? Buried beneath faith, rewritten through empires, eroded by time, the past may not be what we inherited in school books. It may be something engineered, edited, and fiercely protected. Because long before any kingdom carved its name into stone, long before the first priest lifted a torch inside a temple, something else walked this planet. Something that left behind fragments. Clay tablets scorched by ancient fire, lists of kings whose reigns stretched tens of thousands of years, stories of beings descending from the heavens not as spirits, but as rulers, scientists, and exiles. And in the shadows of those fragments lies a possibility so unsettling that entire civilizations may have tried to bury it. That humanity was shaped not only by floods and wars, but by intentions older than any nation, older than any belief, older even than the civilizations we call the first. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. The story begins long before anyone on this planet lifted a stone to build a city, long before the first grains of cultivated wheat ever broke the soil, long before human memory even learned how to remember. In that distant age, when the earth was still an unclaimed sphere of oceans, mountains, storms, and unshaped potential, something arrived from beyond. And the strangest part is this. The oldest civilizations we know, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, did not hesitate to say it outright. They wrote it plainly on clay tablets, etched it into their king lists, carved it into myths that scholars would later dismiss as imaginative theology. They told us that beings from the sky descended here with purpose, with hierarchy, with exile and ambition, and with technology that ancient scribes tried desperately to describe using the only language they had. They called them Anunnaki, those who from the heavens to the earth came. But in the oldest layers of the story, before translation filtered their names, they were simply travelers. Travelers whose origin was not a mystical realm, but a world circling far beyond the planets we know. Those early writers described a planet with a long, stretched orbit, a world called Nibiru. Imagine a celestial body taking thousands of Earth years to complete a single loop around the sun, spending part of its cycle in warmth and part in a cold so deep that its atmosphere compressed like armor. On that world, according to ancient accounts, life had already flourished for ages beyond counting. Societies had risen, collapsed, unified, and fractured again. Dynasties had battled for legitimacy, nobles argued over inheritance, and sages tried to interpret the movement of stars as signs of what was to come. Their histories, preserved in fragmented tablets found in ruins of temples and private collections, describe wars so destructive they reshaped continents, political struggles that determined who ruled entire hemispheres, and environmental catastrophes powerful enough to threaten their species with extinction. The tablets portray a world in crisis, not in mythic imagery, but in the grounded details of climate change, volcanic decline, atmospheric thinning, and the desperate search for survival. And from that desperation came an extraordinary plan, one that would ultimately intertwine their fate with Earth. They needed gold, not for wealth or ornamentation, but because powdered gold, suspended in their atmosphere, was believed to repair the damage that was slowly destroying their world. The idea is strange to us, but when understood as an attempt to create a reflective shield, something like an ancient version of atmospheric engineering, it suddenly feels less fantastical. The rulers of Nibiru argued, debated, tested, failed, and tried again. They sent fleets of chariots, which in ancient texts refer not to wooden carts, but to vehicles that blaze like fire and rise like arrows into the sky. And eventually, one leader, cast out after losing a throne, took a forbidden craft and fled into the deep, cold void of space. His name was Enlil, a former king, a usurper in exile, and the first being described to approach Earth not as a mythic god, but as a desperate traveler gambling everything on a final hope. When he reached Earth, the oldest tablets say his ship plunged through an atmosphere so dense it roared like an oven around the hull. He crashed into the waters of this planet with such violence that he lost consciousness and awoke believing he had died. But he was alive, and more importantly, the planet beneath him shimmered with a promise he had hoped but not dared to believe. The presence of gold in its rivers, its mountains, and deep within the places where oceans meet the land. This discovery, this moment of an exiled king standing alone on a young Earth, marks the first intersection between humanity's home and a civilization that had already lived through cycles of rise and ruin. Later, after the political storms of their world shifted again, a grand mission was sent to Earth, not in legends framed as spiritual journeys, but in what ancient scribes described as voyages across the upper waters, a poetic phrase for the vacuum we call space. That mission was led by a figure whose name echoes through every surviving fragment, Ea. In the oldest Sumerian texts, Ea means he whose home is water, a reference scholars have tried to interpret in various ways, perhaps the oceans of Earth, perhaps the abyss of space, or perhaps the water-laden atmosphere of his home world. But whatever the origin, the texts describe him as a scientist, an engineer, a problem solver. They say he was the one who understood genetics before humans even understood how to plant a consistent harvest. He was the one who examined the early hominids wandering Earth's valleys and saw not beasts, but raw potential. According to these ancient records, life on Earth was abundant but primitive. Hominids could shape stones, build fires, and migrate with the seasons, but they lacked the capacity to perform the labor needed for Nibiru's survival, mining gold at a scale massive enough to rebuild an atmosphere. What Ea proposed was as radical then as it sounds now, adapting the existing inhabitants of Earth through a process the scribes described as mixing the essence, a phrase that many modern readers interpret as a poetic way of recording genetic engineering. His goal was not to replace life here, but to elevate it, creating beings who could understand commands, operate tools, communicate, adapt, and eventually build. The earliest attempt, according to the tablets, failed. The beings could not reproduce. They lived but did not continue. In mythic retellings, this is mirrored in the story of Adam, created from the clay of the earth, shaped, guided, but ultimately unable to carry forward life. It was only when Ea introduced a second modification, a subtle shift, a gift of the seed, as the texts call it, that humanity as we know it began. Suddenly, the beings of Earth could multiply, diversify, and spread. They were no longer creatures following instinct. They were workers, thinkers, wanderers, dreamers. And with this success began a kind of cooperation between worlds, though the balance of power was always uneven. The visitors built cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Sippar, names that appear in the oldest Sumerian king lists. They established mission centers, spaceports, councils, and hierarchies. The texts describe towering structures used to bind heaven and earth, interpreted today as early monuments or technological stations. Leadership was divided. Ea oversaw engineering and science, while his half-brother Enlil, stern, commanding, was given political control, a decision that sowed tension between their factions for generations. Humanity grew under their guidance. To the ancient mind, these beings were simply gods, creatures who lived for thousands of years, who commanded storms, who entered and exited the sky in machines glowing with fire. And yet, in their own writings, they are flawed, emotional, bound by rivalries and ambitions. They disagreed, they envied, they loved and hated. They made choices that echoed across millennia, shaping not just their society but the trajectory of ours. As humans multiplied, the world changed. Cities spread, temples rose, early kings emerged, chosen not by human councils but appointed by the visitors who claimed divine sanction. And then something unexpected happened. The very beings engineered to be helpers became nations with identities, tribes with memory, clans with stories. Humans looked at their creators with awe, but also with questions. Why were they here? What was their world like? What did their wars mean for Earth? And in a move that would alter everything, some of the visitors decided to pass on their knowledge not through temples or royal families, but through individuals, scribes, prophets, chosen witnesses. One of the oldest such stories describes a man taken in a whirlwind to a hidden chamber to receive an account carved on glowing blue stone tablets, not metaphors, but literal tablets described as lapis lazuli, hard, precious, and sacred. These tablets, the scribe wrote, were inscribed not in clay that could crumble, but in a material meant to endure ages of catastrophe. They recounted not just Earth's story, but the entire saga of Nibiru, its dynasties, its cycles, its wars, and its tragedies. They also offered warnings, prophecies tied to celestial cycles, eclipses, and the return of certain heavenly bodies. To ancient cultures, the sky was not symbolic. It was a living calendar, a cosmic script detailing the fate of nations. As Earth's population grew, the visitors faced challenges they had not anticipated. Their own lifespans began to shorten, a consequence attributed to spending too much time away from their home world's orbit. Their children born on Earth lived lives dramatically shorter than those born on Nibiru. To a civilization accustomed to living tens of thousands of years, this was not simply aging, it was loss, suffering, and fear. Some blamed Ea, others Enlil, others the planet itself. Arguments escalated into disputes escalated into feuds, and eventually, factions formed around competing heirs who believed they alone deserved to inherit leadership over Earth. The tension reached a breaking point during what the tablets refer to as the Era of Marduk, a son of Ea whose rise unsettled the balance of power. His supporters built temples, monuments, and cities in his honor. His detractors accused him of overstepping cosmic timing, claiming that his ascension violated celestial order. Caught in this storm were humans who were encouraged or manipulated to take sides, forming alliances, kingdoms, and dynasties tied to heavenly factions they barely understood. The world became a stage for conflicts born on another planet. And then came the catastrophe, not the flood described later in legend. That event was devastating but survivable. But something else, something the tablets describe with chilling clarity. A weapon that created not water, but poisoned air, a storm that moved west to east, wiping out cities, scorching fields, and leaving whole regions silent. The texts say it was unleashed not by destiny, but by choice. A choice made in a council of powerful beings who had forgotten the fragile world they were living on. When the wind came, even they fled their cities, abandoning temples, palaces, and the humans who had worshipped them for centuries. The aftermath was described as a time when Sumer was left empty, when rivers ran with death instead of life, when entire populations vanished. And into that silence stepped the same figure who had once shaped humanity from clay, the same scientist, exile, and creator. Ea, but not as a ruler this time, nor as a distant god. He came as a witness, as someone determined to record what had led to this great unraveling so that those who survived, and their distant descendants, would understand the truth. He dictated his account to a scribe, describing the rise and fall of his people, the creation of humans, the conflicts that tore apart kingdoms, and the cycles of fate that bind worlds together. His message, preserved in fragments scattered across continents, tells us that history does not move in a straight line. It circles, it loops, it returns. And so the question emerges, trembling beneath every ancient text, every recovered tablet, every broken myth. If what was will be again, then what cycle are we standing in now? What echoes are returning? And what role, unknowingly, are we playing in a story written long before the first human city ever cast a shadow across the earth? The world that emerged after the great calamity was nothing like the world that had existed before. The cities that once glimmered under the rule of sky-born kings lay in ruins, their ziggurats half buried under drifting sands, their holy precincts silent except for the wind whispering through shattered doorways. The rivers that once fed millions had turned bitter, their waters carrying the taste of death. Entire regions once bursting with life were suddenly barren, their farmlands brittle as ash. Even the mountains seemed to mourn, holding the quiet weight of destruction in their stony bones. Yet in the midst of this silence, in the fragile breath between endings and beginnings, survivors walked among the fallen stone, carrying with them stories carved out of trauma, memory, and the faintest hope that someone, or something, might explain why their world had been torn apart. And it was in this period of devastation that the oldest surviving accounts say Ea, the ancient architect of humanity's destiny, returned to gather the fragments of history before they vanished forever. The scribe to whom Ea spoke described seeing a whirlwind descend from the sky like a silent storm. It glowed with a reddish aura, and from its belly extended 4 straight supports that touched the earth before the swirling light resolved into 2 figures, each wearing garments that shone like polished brass. Their faces, though human-like, held an otherworldly stillness, as if untouched by wind or time. They called the scribe by name, told him not to fear, and lifted him between earth and sky. From the height of their ascent, he saw the ruined lands beneath him, rivers choked with debris, plains where once thriving cities were now nothing but dark smudges, temples stripped of their divine guardians, roads where no traveler moved. This vision, half physical and half spiritual, was meant to prepare him for what he would hear after he was taken to the hidden sanctuary where Ea waited. The chamber he was brought into was unlike anything the scribe had known. It was not a temple, nor a palace, nor a natural cave. Its walls glowed as though lit from within, yet no flame flickered anywhere. The air shimmered with an aura the scribe described as living darkness, a darkness that held presence rather than emptiness. In the center of this chamber, a table stood upon a raised stone, its surface lined with blue tablets so polished they reflected light like still water. These tablets, the scribe wrote, were carved from lapis lazuli, deep, sky-colored, and sacred in ancient civilizations. On their surfaces glowed faint etchings, waiting to be filled by the stylus placed beside them. This stylus, unlike the reed tools used by human scribes, was made of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, shaped with a tip as sharp and delicate as an eagle's talon. Its touch did not scratch the stone, but marked it as easily as if it were clay. Aya's voice, heavy with centuries of memory, echoed through the darkness, instructing the scribe to write, to seal, and to preserve the truth before the world forgot it entirely. He began by recounting the earliest days of his own world, Nibiru, long before it ever approached the orbit of Earth. His people, in their prime, lived under the protection of a dense atmosphere fed by volcanic activity, shielded from the extremes of space. Their lifespans stretched into tens of thousands of years, long enough for empires to rise and fall within a single lifetime. But even such longevity could not save them from the gradual decay of their world. Volcanoes quieted, the atmosphere thinned, and the once nourishing climate turned hostile. This decline, he explained, was not sudden, but occurred over cycles, each one leaving their society weaker. Sages and scientists sought solutions, from engineering atmospheric shields to rekindling ancient volcanic systems, but none of these measures could restore their world to what it once had been. The rulers of Nibiru were forced to search beyond their skies. Their search led to a bold plan: acquiring gold, a metal whose reflective properties made it invaluable for atmospheric repair. Powdered into the finest dust and released high above their world, it could form a protective layer capable of preserving warmth, filtering sunlight, and restoring climatic balance. But gold was scarce on Nibiru. The hammered bracelet, a belt of asteroids encircling the sun, was rich in the metal, but every attempt to mine it had ended in disaster. Ships were crushed, supplies were lost, and lives were taken by the unpredictable storms of rock and ice that guarded the belt. Desperation grew, and with desperation came rebellion. When the throne passed to a new king by a council's decree, a noble named Alalu, who believed he had been robbed of his rightful inheritance, waged a private war within the palace. He challenged the ruling king to a ritual combat, an ancient Nibiruan method of settling contested succession, and after defeating him, Alalu seized the throne. Yet his rule was not stable. He was seen by some as a savior, and by others as an illegitimate usurper. Under pressure, he turned again to the problem of their failing world, and ordered ships to reattempt mining in the hammered bracelet. But the missions again met ruin. With no other options, he authorized the use of forbidden weapons, ancient devices capable of triggering violent geological reactions. These weapons, relics from an older epoch of Nibiruan warfare, were feared even by the gods. Their detonations could shake mountains, split valleys, and pollute the air with a poisonous wind. But Alalu believed they might reawaken dormant volcanoes and restore their atmosphere. When they failed, he faced total loss of confidence. Even his cupbearer, Anu, who served him faithfully, was whispered by some to be better suited for the throne. Fearing deposition, Alalu made a desperate choice. He fled in a celestial chariot, one of the few capable of bypassing the asteroid belt unharmed, and set off through the void towards the only world left that held any hope: Earth, the seventh planet. His flight was long and fraught with danger. Tablets describe him encountering celestial bodies known to ancient astronomers: Gaga, the wandering messenger; An, the blue giant; Antu, his shimmering companion, and witnessing cosmic events like eclipses, storms of charged particles, and tidal forces pulling at his ship. As he approached Earth, he maneuvered past the sixth planet, a massive, storm-ridden sphere described as being surrounded by a host of attendants, perhaps the ancient memory of Saturn with its rings and moons. Through these trials, Alalu pressed forward until he saw Earth's snow-capped poles and blue oceans appear beneath him. When he landed, crash-landed, according to the oldest texts, he tasted the waters of Earth and found signs of gold in their currents. This discovery, if brought back to Nibiru, could have secured his place as eternal king, for he alone had found the resource their world needed to survive. But as he explored Earth, he realized he could not return alone. The journey back required manpower, equipment, and a coordinated mission. He sent messages towards the heavens, and eventually a second mission was dispatched. This mission was led by Ea, who had been tasked by Anu, the same cupbearer who had once bowed before Alalu, to oversee the extraction of gold from Earth. Ea's arrival on Earth marked the beginning of a new era for both worlds. Unlike Alalu, who approached Earth as a desperate exile, Ea approached it as a scientist. He studied its plants, animals, geological formations, and early hominids with a curiosity rooted in method rather than fear. The oldest tablets describe him walking the marshlands near the Persian Gulf, mapping the coastline, observing how rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates shaped fertile terrain, and noting how early humans gathered reeds, hunted animals, and shaped tools. These observations convinced him that Earth was not merely a place to extract resources, but a world overflowing with potential. A world whose inhabitants could be elevated to assist in the survival of another species. But Ea's mission was not universally supported. His half-brother Enlil arrived soon after, sent to take command of Earth's operations. Where Ea saw possibilities, Enlil saw a workforce. Where Ea believed in partnership, Enlil believed in hierarchy. Their disagreements, subtle at first, grew sharper with time and would echo through centuries of human myth as the divide between benevolent and wrathful gods. To some, Ea was the giver of knowledge, the craftsman, the teacher. To others, Enlil became the stern ruler, the one who demanded obedience and punished disobedience with floods, storms, and famine. As gold operations increased, it became clear that mining was grueling and dangerous. The Anunnaki laborers, described as gods who toil, grew weary and eventually rebelled. They refused to continue digging through scorching heat and oppressive darkness. In the council that followed, Ea proposed a radical solution, creating a new kind of worker using Earth's existing life forms. He explained that early hominids possessed the physical strength needed for the task, but lacked the intelligence and coordination. By blending essences, a term ancient languages used to describe the core of life, he could shape a being capable of understanding commands, organizing labor, and enduring difficult conditions. After failed attempts that resulted in sterile hybrids, he succeeded in creating a prototype capable of reproduction. This event, immortalized in later traditions as the creation of Adam and Eve, formed the foundation of human civilization as we know it. Yet with creation came consequences. Humans multiplied rapidly, forming communities, developing primitive rituals, and organizing into clans. They looked to their creators not as distant overseers, but as divine guardians. Temples arose where they offered grain, animals, and prayers, hoping to win favor or avert wrath. Cities expanded, linking Earth's oldest civilizations into networks of trade and communication. But the Anunnaki, whose own politics were complex, began to see humanity not merely as helpers, but as participants in their rivalries. Ea's children, Enlil's descendants, and other lineages of sky-born beings all sought influence over human kings and priests. They gave rise to dynasties, each claiming legitimacy through divine ancestry, celestial signs, or direct encounters with their alien patrons. Over time, these rivalries escalated into open conflict. Marduk, the ambitious son of Ea, sought to establish himself as the supreme deity over Earth, arguing that celestial omens, planetary alignments understood by ancient astronomers as messages from the heavens, supported his rise. His opponents disagreed, citing cycles of fate and the sacred timing of ascension. Humans aligned themselves with these celestial factions, building temples, armies, and cities dedicated to one lineage or another. The world became divided not just by geography, but by cosmic allegiance. In this tension, prophecies flourished. Scribes described visions of comets, eclipses, and omens seen in the constellations. They spoke of destiny, unchangeable paths like planetary orbits, and of fate, paths that could be bent or broken by choice. This distinction became central to understanding the final rupture that would tear the ancient world apart. That rupture came in the form of a war that unleashed weapons forbidden since the earliest ages of Nibiru. These weapons produced winds that carried death, storms that left no survivors, and poison that seeped into soil, water, and flesh. The cities of Sumer, Ur, Nippur, Eridu, fell one by one. The tablets describe people collapsing in streets, fields turning to dust, and even the gods fleeing their temples in fear. It was not destiny, Ea insisted. It was a choice made by beings who had forgotten the vulnerability of the world they inhabited. His grief, recorded by the scribe who wrote his words, fills the tablets with laments. Laments for ruined cities, poisoned rivers, abandoned temples, and lost people. He spoke of how the great wind spread from west to east, destroying everything in its path. In the aftermath, the survivors, both divine and human, found themselves standing amid devastation so complete that it seemed as if creation itself had been undone. But Ea believed that memory could still be saved. He dictated to the scribe a complete account of what had happened, beginning from the earliest days of Nibiru and ending with the catastrophe that fell upon Earth. His message was simple yet profound. Understand the past so that the future can be navigated, for what has happened before will happen again. The cycles of rise and fall, creation and destruction, destiny and choice repeat like the turning of stars in the night sky. And in the quiet that followed, a new question began to echo among the survivors, one that still lingers through time's corridors. If the gods could fall, what would become of the humans shaped by their hands? Were humans merely witnesses to a cosmic tragedy, or inheritors of a story still unfolding? And if destiny truly follows cycles, then what ancient rhythm, hidden beneath millennia of forgetting, might be preparing to return? In the centuries that followed the Great Devastation, the world tried to breathe again. The rivers slowly reclaimed their clarity, the grasses returned in stubborn patches, and the surviving communities, battered, frightened, yet determined, rebuilt their fires along the ruins of old kingdoms. But if Earth seemed to be healing, those who had once ruled it from above were not so quick to mend. Their divisions, born from rivalries stretching back to Nibiru, only deepened in the aftermath. They had witnessed destruction on a scale that should have humbled any species, yet instead it sharpened resentments, hardened loyalties, and intensified ambitions that had smoldered through ages. To understand how the world arrived at this fragile crossroads, Ea told the scribe, one had to go back even further. Back before the arrival on Earth, before the creation of humans, back to the earliest epochs of Nibiru, when conflict first carved itself into the destiny of his people. In those days, their world was a place of extremes, swinging between blistering heat and frigid darkness as it traveled its enormous elliptical path. Generations were born, lived entire eras, and died before their world returned to the same patch of sky. Their long lives made memory a kind of inheritance, passed not only through texts, but through the living recollections of parents, grandparents, and ancestors who could recount events firsthand across thousands of years. And within those memories was a time of great war, a cycle known later as the North-South conflict. The world of Nibiru had been divided into two powerful nations, each with its own customs, philosophies, and claims of celestial favor. The Northern Kingdom was known for its mastery of science, metallurgy, and the shaping of tools that could harness the forces of nature. The Southern Kingdom prided itself on spiritual authority, tradition, and its claim to be the first blessed by the earliest gods. As the atmosphere thinned and resources dwindled, disputes over territory and succession ignited. Old grudges resurfaced, alliances fractured, and the entire planet was drawn into a conflict that lasted so long it reshaped the psyche of their species. Weapons forged during this age were unlike anything humans would later imagine. Some could hurl thunder across mountains, others could melt stone or tear open the ground. Machines capable of flight, machines capable of breaching the upper atmosphere, machines that could shatter fortresses with a single burst. All were unleashed during the North-South War. Though the records Ea described did not read like mythology, but like the grim notations of generals, the devastation they brought felt mythic in scale. Cities that had stood for tens of thousands of years were reduced to rubble. Fertile plains turned barren. Rivers shifted their courses under the force of weaponry that bent tectonic plates. And through it all, the leaders of each side fought not only to conquer territory, but to control the destiny of Nibiru itself. When peace finally came, it came not through victory, but exhaustion. The survivors, countless in number yet immeasurably diminished in spirit, declared a truce through a new system. A unified throne shared by the bloodlines of both nations. From this union came kings and queens tasked with restoring the land, repairing the atmosphere, and healing the wounds inflicted by a war that had nearly erased their species. But even as the planet stabilized, the scars of conflict remained, embedded not only in the land, but in the very laws that governed succession. These laws, complex, sometimes contradictory, created the environment in which figures like Alalu and Anu would later fight for dominance. Ea emphasized that these ancient struggles were not forgotten by the time his people reached Earth. They traveled with them, hidden in their bones, influencing every decision they made in the new world. For a while, the mission on Earth flourished. Gold flowed from the mines of the Abzu, regions we now know as rich in mineral deposits stretching across parts of Africa. The processing centers in Mesopotamia refined it into fine powder, shipped to Mars outposts, and eventually ferried to Nibiru. Cities like Eridu, founded by Ea himself, became hubs of knowledge. Ea taught humans agriculture, irrigation, writing, and computation not to elevate them beyond control, but because a skilled workforce was more efficient. Humans learned quickly, adapting faster than any being from Nibiru could have anticipated. Some of Ea's children even took human wives, despite the political consequences. Their offspring formed hybrid lineages, long-lived, brilliant, sometimes unstable, who would later become central figures in the legends of gods, demigods, and giants. But while Ea worked, Enlil watched. He saw humanity's growth not as a blessing, but as a threat. Where Ea saw potential, Enlil saw insolence. He was a commander, not a nurturer, and to him, humans were laborers, necessary but expendable. The quicker they multiplied, the more Enlil feared their presence. He began to impose strict rules, restricting human access to knowledge, forbidding them from entering certain cities, and limiting their ability to learn advanced arts. These restrictions later inspired myths about forbidden fruits, sacred mountains barred to mortals, and gods who punished those who reached for divine secrets. Ea countered this by quietly sharing what he believed humans needed to survive. He taught chosen individuals astronomy, healing, metallurgy, and sacred geometry, the principles that governed how temples were aligned with stars, how calendars tracked celestial cycles, and how seasons could be predicted by observing the heavens. These teachings would eventually filter into Sumerian, Babylonian, and Egyptian knowledge systems. But each act of guidance Ea offered made Enlil more suspicious, more fearful that humanity might one day challenge their authority. The tension between the brothers intensified when Anu himself visited Earth. Anu's journey was rare and significant. His presence signaled political upheaval of the highest order. While he met with both sons, disaster struck. One of his escorts, enraged by past grievances, attacked him. The resulting confrontation left Alalu, the former king who had fled to Earth, dead, his life ended by the very being he had once served. But his death did not end his legacy. His faction, still strong among certain Anunnaki, blamed Anu's lineage for treachery. Their anger simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the next spark. After Anu returned to Nibiru, Enlil emerged as the uncontested ruler of all Earth operations. He moved the administrative center from Eridu to Nippur, centralizing power and placing himself atop the hierarchy. Ea was permitted to continue overseeing technology and science, but political authority was now firmly in Enlil's hands. This shift changed everything. Where Ea had governed with curiosity and patience, Enlil governed with efficiency and strict order. He pushed for expanded mining operations, greater human labor, and tighter control over Earth's resources. Humanity, meanwhile, continued its unpredictable evolution. They formed tribes, kingdoms, and allegiances based on which god, Ea, Enlil, Inanna, Utu, Ninhursag, Marduk, they believed protected them. And because these gods were not illusions but literal beings descending from the sky in fiery machines, their influence shaped entire cultures. Cities rose in their honor, Ur for Nana, Uruk for Inanna, Sippar for Utu, Nippur for Enlil, Eridu for Ea. Each became a center of worship, governance, and trade, and each became a pawn in the cosmic rivalries that continued to play out. But the true fracture occurred when Marduk, Ea's ambitious son, decided that he deserved rulership not only over Earth, but over Nibiru as well. Marduk was brilliant, charismatic, and immensely influential among both humans and younger Anunnaki. When he established Babylon as his chosen city, its rising ziggurat was described by ancient scribes as a gateway to the gods, a place where heaven and earth met. Enlil saw it as a threat, a direct challenge to his authority. The celestial omens, especially planetary alignments that ancient astronomers believed signified divine approval, became central to Marduk's claims. He argued that his star, which humans later associated with Jupiter, had risen to prominence. To him, this meant the age was shifting, justifying his ascension. The debates in the Anunnaki Council grew increasingly hostile. Some supported Marduk's interpretation of celestial cycles, while others insisted the timing was wrong. Old resentments resurfaced: Ea's lineage versus Enlil's, Earth-born children versus Nibiru-born elders, innovators versus traditionalists. In the midst of this, Marduk's growing human followers, fiercely loyal, numerous, and fueled by prophecy, became a political force impossible to ignore. As human populations expanded, so did their awareness. They began noticing inconsistencies. Why did some gods age and others not? Why did certain divine beings die while others lived for ages? Why did some gods favor certain cities over others? Why did they war among themselves if they were truly omnipotent? These questions, dangerous in their implications, circulated in temple schools and among priest scribes. Some high priests began recording their doubts in hidden scrolls, afraid to share them publicly. A few even traveled across deserts and mountains, seeking truth from older civilizations that had preserved fragments of earlier contact. What they found was unsettling. In remote caves, buried libraries, and ruins older than their own histories, they discovered hints of a pre-flood world where humans had once reached astonishing heights. Heights abruptly erased by catastrophe. They found tablets describing advanced tools, star knowledge, and cities whose designs matched celestial patterns far too precisely to be accidental. They found records of beings arriving from the sea, not the sky, suggesting that not all visitors descended from above. Even older myths spoke of giant beings who roamed Earth before humans were created, creatures sometimes described as offspring of unions between gods and mortals. These were the beings later called Nephilim. Enlil, disturbed by the direction humanity was moving, began advocating for stricter control. The growing population, he argued, was becoming too unruly, too inquisitive, too independent. They were no longer the simple laborers designed to follow commands. They were developing language, art, ritual, and identity, attributes that would one day make them capable of rebellion. The more they learned, the more they questioned. The more they questioned, the more Enlil feared they would challenge their divine authority. The breaking point came when Enlil discovered that humans, aided by Ea's secret guidance, had learned how to track celestial cycles. They had begun constructing observatories and predicting eclipses. They were beginning to understand the movements of planets in ways once reserved only for the Anunnaki. They were learning to read the skies not as divine messages, but as natural cycles. This knowledge, to Enlil, was dangerous. It meant humans were no longer dependent on the gods to interpret fate. And so Enlil, frustrated and fearful, decided the world needed a cleansing. The ancient texts describe his declaration not as a moment of anger, but as one of cold calculation. He believed humanity had exceeded its intended purpose. He believed their unchecked growth threatened the order established by the gods. He believed the earth itself would soon face a natural cataclysm, a massive flood triggered by celestial alignment, and he saw it as an opportunity. Rather than warn humanity, he chose to let the deluge come, wiping the slate clean. To him, this was destiny. He disagreed. He believed destiny could be bent, that humans deserved survival, that their potential was a gift and not a threat. Secretly, he warned a righteous man, Ziusudra, in the oldest tablets, later known as Noah, giving him instructions to build a vessel capable of riding out the flood. This act of defiance became one of the greatest betrayals in divine history. Enlil's fury after the flood was immense, but when the waters receded and humanity emerged from survival, he was forced to confront a reality he had never anticipated. Humans had survived despite his will. This survival tilted the balance again. Humanity, now fewer in number but stronger in spirit, spread across the world carrying fragments of memory, fragments that would eventually become the myths of dozens of cultures. They remembered gods flying in chariots of fire. They remembered temples aligned with the stars. They remembered giants who walked the earth. They remembered a flood that reshaped the world. But the greatest shift came not from what humans remembered, but from what the Anunnaki lost: their unity. The catastrophe, the betrayals, and the rising ambitions split them so deeply that they no longer acted as one people. Factions formed. Some Anunnaki chose to withdraw, others remained to rule. Still others sought revenge. And among all of them, one question lingered like a shadow. If humans could survive the flood, could they one day rise beyond the gods? He believed they could. Enlil believed they must never. Marduk believed he should lead them. And in the centuries that followed, the collision of these beliefs would ignite new conflicts, shape new empires, and carve into history a pattern that humans would later mistake for divine will rather than the echoes of ancient political strife. Yet, through it all, one truth endured. The cycles of destiny were not finished. Not for the gods, not for humanity, not for Earth. And the scribe who recorded Ea's words understood that he wasn't merely documenting a past, but capturing a warning. That what had been would be again, that the wheels of fate turned not in straight lines, but in vast repeating arcs, and that someday, when the heavens shifted once more, the echoes of ancient Nibiru would return. In the long shadows cast by the flood and the great calamity that preceded it, the world entered an age of uneasy rebuilding. Humans emerged from the mountains, islands, and highlands where they had survived, wandering into plains littered with bones of cities their ancestors barely remembered. They brought with them stories, fragments of visions carried down from those who had been warned, and from those who had seen chariots in the sky disappear into clouds moments before the waters rose. These stories, twisted by fear and awe, began forming the myths that would later shape entire civilizations. But beneath the folklore was a hidden layer of truth. The gods had not left. They had merely retreated, reorganizing themselves, plotting their next moves in a world whose destiny they still believed they controlled. Ea told the scribe that after the flood, the Anunnaki gathered to decide whether humans should remain. Enlil, frustrated that the deluge had not achieved the cleansing he intended, argued that humanity should be heavily limited, a restrained species, prevented from becoming too powerful, too numerous, too independent. But other voices, especially those influenced by Ea's lineage, argued otherwise. They reminded the council that humans were no longer just creations, they were witnesses. They had endured not one, but two cosmic catastrophes, and yet continued rising. To eliminate them now would be to erase the living proof of what had been done. And so a compromise was reached. Humans would rebuild, populations would grow, and civilization would restart. But under the watchful eyes of gods whose patience had already begun fraying. The earliest cities after the flood were guided by these divine hands. The tablets describe how the gods apportioned territories across Earth, dividing the planet into spheres of influence. Enlil claimed the central lands of Sumer, where his temples rose again from ruin. Ea kept regions farther south, including the Abzu, where humans worked in the mines that had once been the heart of the gold-gathering mission. Ninhursag, the goddess of life and medicine, restored healing centers and taught the survivors how to cultivate herbs, grains, and medicinal plants. To Utu, the shining one associated with the sun, fell the city of Sippar, a center of law and justice where scribes learned to carve rules upon tablets, and to Inanna, fierce and ambitious, was given Uruk, which would become a great cultural and political metropolis whose ziggurats would rise like stairways toward the heavens. Each of these gods helped shape early post-flood civilizations. They offered gifts of knowledge, agriculture, brick-making, irrigation techniques, metallurgy, framed as divine blessings. But these gifts were also tools of control. Knowledge was layered, limited, and divided among classes. Priests, chosen carefully, were taught more advanced skills. Kings, appointed by divine decree, were entrusted with calendars tied to celestial movements. Ordinary workers were taught only what they needed for their trades. This deliberate distribution ensured that no single human group could independently decipher the full tapestry of the heavens, the sciences, or the origins of their creators. Control was embedded into every layer of the new world. But control does not prevent ambition, it only delays it. And as the cities grew, so did the influence of the gods who ruled them. Among these gods, none embodied ambition more fiercely than Inanna. She had survived the calamity with her pride intact and her determination sharpened. She looked at the ruins of the world not with despair, but with the eyes of a strategist. She saw opportunity in chaos, potential in human vulnerability, and power in aligning herself with rising civilizations. Her temples became the centers of culture, art, and kingship rituals. Poets praised her beauty, warriors sought her blessing before battle, queens emulated her boldness. Her presence was felt in every corner of Uruk, where she inspired both devotion and fear. Marduk, meanwhile, continued to pursue his claim to supremacy. The destruction wrought by the weapons of the gods had devastated his followers, yet he refused to accept defeat. Babylon, once a small settlement, became his chosen city. Under his guidance, it grew rapidly, drawing people from distant regions with promises of protection and prosperity. His human priests cultivated a powerful mythology around him, portraying him as the rightful ruler of Earth, chosen by celestial signs and destined to lead humanity into a new age. This narrative, spread through temples, festivals, and astronomical schools, challenged the authority of Enlil's lineage and set the stage for renewed conflict. Ea watched these developments with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Humanity had advanced far beyond its early days of stone tools and simple villages. They now built cities with walls that stretched for miles, dug canals that redirected entire rivers, and measured time through complex calendars aligned to the stars. But Ea knew that the seeds of rivalry planted among the gods were also taking root among humans. Kings began to fight one another not for land or resources, but for divine favor. Priests interpreted celestial events to justify wars, conquests, and alliances. And as generations passed, the original reasons for these divine rivalries became obscured, replaced by human interpretations that layered myth upon myth until truth and story became inseparable. It was during this period of cultural flowering and political danger that the scribe recorded one of Ea's most important teachings: that destiny and fate were not the same. Destiny, he explained, was like the orbit of a planet, set in motion by forces beyond anyone's control, following paths carved long before any being was born. Fate, however, was the realm of choice, actions taken by individuals that could alter the course of events within the boundaries of destiny. Humans, he warned, too often mistook destiny for fate, believing they were powerless against the will of the gods. But the gods themselves misinterpreted fate as destiny, believing their choices were inevitable rather than deliberate. This misunderstanding had shaped countless conflicts on both Earth and Nibiru. Ea recounted how leaders on his homeworld had once believed the decline of their atmosphere was destined, not realizing their failure to adapt quickly was a choice that worsened their crisis. He recounted how rulers on Earth believed the flood was fate, when in truth it had been a choice made by Enlil, one of many that revealed how flawed divine reasoning could be. The scribe was told to write all of this so future generations would understand that even the gods were not immune to error. They wielded immense power, but their hearts were susceptible to jealousy, fear, ambition, and regret just as humans were. As the world stabilized, new generations of humans emerged who had never known the flood firsthand. They knew only the cities their grandparents had built and the laws enforced by priests who claimed divine authority. These priests, inheriting fragmentary knowledge, often guarded their secrets fiercely. They lived between two worlds, the human world of farms, markets, and households, and the divine world of temples, rituals, and celestial observation. Many priests genuinely believed they served the gods with pure intent. Others saw priesthood as a path to influence, wealth, and prestige. Few understood the full truth of their origins. Into this environment of reverence and ambition arrived a new problem: signs in the heavens that suggested another cosmic event was approaching. Astronomers noted unusual movements in the sky, stars brightening, planets shifting more rapidly, and certain constellations aligning in patterns once associated with great upheavals. The tablets describe these observations not as superstition, but as rigorous celestial tracking, the same kind of science that guided seasons, harvests, and religious festivals. These signs troubled the Anunnaki. They reminded them of similar alignments that had preceded catastrophes on Nibiru, including atmospheric collapses, volcanic eruptions, and ancient wars. Marduk interpreted these signs as validation of his claim to power. He proclaimed that the heavens were declaring the start of his reign, aligning with the cycles associated with his star. His followers spread this message throughout Babylon, igniting fervor among people who longed for a leader, both powerful and present. Enlil, however, interpreted the same signs as warnings, a celestial reminder of the consequences of unrestrained ambition. He feared that granting Marduk control over Earth would plunge the world into chaos once again, especially given Marduk's desire to place humans at the center of his future empire. Thus, the rivalries deepened, and the world stood at the brink of conflict. Cities that had once traded peacefully now armed themselves, preparing for wars they believed the gods demanded. Inanna, whose ambitions rivaled Marduk's, maneuvered politically, forming alliances with cities that feared Babylon's rising influence. Her presence on the battlefield, described by scribes as descending from the sky in a storm of fire, terrified enemies and emboldened allies. Ea, watching all of this unfold, understood that humanity's fate was again entangled in the quarrels of beings who believed themselves beyond consequence. It was during one of these tense years that Ea revealed to the scribe another secret. The gods were aging, not in the human sense of frailty and decay, but in their celestial cycles. Time on Earth affected them differently than time on Nibiru. Their bodies, their cells, their essence, the life force described in ancient texts, were tuned to the rhythms of their homeworld's orbit, not Earth's. As centuries passed on Earth, they felt the weight of time compressing upon them. Some grew weary, some grew desperate, and some grew reckless, fearing they would not live to see their legacies completed. This fear shaped many of their decisions. It made certain gods cling to power, others withdraw in resignation, and still others push for radical changes to secure influence while they still could. The humans who lived closest to them noticed subtle changes, diminished vitality, slower movements, older voices. To explain these changes, priests created myths about gods entering cycles of sleep, rebirth, or withdrawal from the world. But the truth, Ea said, was rooted in biology, not myth. The gods were not dying, but they were not ageless either. Their vulnerability, once unimaginable to humans, became a dangerous secret. If humanity learned their gods could weaken, lose power, or die, the structure that maintained divine authority would crumble. This vulnerability made the rivalries even sharper. Marduk sought to secure his power quickly, knowing time was no longer on his side. Enlil grew harsher, enforcing laws more rigidly, fearing that any sign of weakness could embolden rebellion. Inanna doubled down on military expansion, believing she could secure her legacy through conquest. And Ea, who had never sought power over nations, began to feel the weight of regret for the knowledge he had shared and the life he had shaped into existence. In the centuries that followed, wars erupted across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and beyond. Each war carried the shadow of divine rivalry. Kings fought, believing they carried out the will of the gods. Armies marched under banners bearing divine symbols. Temples formed alliances, sending messengers across deserts to negotiate with other priesthoods. The gods themselves intervened at times, turning the tide of battle with storms, plagues, or weapons that terrified those who witnessed them. But even the gods could not stop the slow unraveling. Each conflict weakened the fabric of their influence. Each generation of humans grew further removed from the time when gods walked openly among them. Eventually, Ea said, the world reached a point where too much blood had been spilled, too many cities reduced to dust, too many warnings ignored. The last great war, one that would nearly erase the Sumerian civilization, brought about the end of direct divine rule on Earth. Weapons of terror, long forbidden, were unleashed again. Poisonous winds swept across plains, scorching everything in their path. The gods fled their cities, abandoning temples they had inhabited for millennia. Humans died in great numbers, with survivors fleeing to mountains, deserts, islands, and far lands, where the stories of gods became myths carried on the tongues of travelers and poets. Ea watched this destruction with profound sorrow. He told the scribe that none of it had been fate. Every disaster, from the flood to the great wind to the wars that followed, had been shaped by choice, error, pride, and fear. Even those beings humans had called gods were not immune to the consequences of their actions. They had forgotten the fragile balance between creation and destruction. They had forgotten the responsibilities that came with their power. And in the end, they had become victims of their own cycles. Yet Ea insisted the story was not merely one of tragedy. Humanity had survived. And survival, he believed, meant destiny remained in motion. He told the scribe that humans would rise again, not as servants of gods, but as inheritors of a planet once shaped by beings who ultimately failed to govern it wisely. He warned that the cycles of the heavens would one day realign, bringing new challenges, new encounters, and perhaps even echoes of the past. But he expressed a quiet hope that humanity, having endured so much, might learn from the mistakes etched into these ancient tablets. And so the scribe wrote, tablet after tablet, in a chamber lit by an otherworldly glow. He carved the truth into stone, meant to outlast empires. He sealed the tablets in a chest made of acacia and gold, as Ea instructed, so that future generations might find them when the time was right. For Ea believed deeply in one final principle. The past is not dead. It sleeps, waiting to be found. And when it wakes, those who understand it may shape the future in ways the gods themselves never could. Long after the cities of Sumer rose and fell beneath the ambitions of gods and kings, the world entered a strange twilight of remembrance and forgetting. Empires rebuilt themselves upon the ruins of older empires. Temples rose atop shattered foundations, and new myths grew like vines over the broken stones of a past still too vast for humans to understand. Yet beneath this surface of human striving, the echoes of the Anunnaki lingered, sometimes in the movements of armies, sometimes in whispers among priesthoods, sometimes in the strange lights reported in the skies above deserts and mountains. Though their presence became rarer, their influence never fully vanished. They had shaped the world too deeply to disappear without leaving fractures behind. Ea told the scribe that by this era, most of the great gods had withdrawn, choosing distance over direct rule. Some returned to Nibiru, seeking refuge in the rhythms of their home world. Others hid themselves in remote sanctuaries on Earth, mountaintop retreats, island strongholds, underground chambers carved so precisely they seemed grown rather than built. They became watchers rather than rulers. But even watchers leave traces. Some of these traces seeped into the earliest priestly traditions of Egypt, where visitors from the eastern lands taught the first pharaohs sacred geometry and the alignment of temples with the stars. Others appeared in the myths of the Indus Valley, where beings described as radiant and skyborn descended to teach knowledge of fire, breath, and cosmic order. And in remote regions of the Americas, early tribes recorded stories of tall, pale figures emerging from the sea, bearing gifts of agriculture and mathematics. Though separated by oceans and languages, these stories carried the same underlying signature: the memory of a world once shaped by beings who no longer walked openly among humans. But even as these memories faded into legend, a deeper truth remained. The gods may have retreated, but their conflicts, rooted in jealousy, succession, ambition, and cosmic cycles, continued casting long shadows over humanity. These shadows influenced everything: the rise of early kings, the construction of monumental architecture, the formation of priestly castes, the codification of laws, the division of territories, the waging of wars. Humans believed they fought for land, honor, or survival. But often they fought for legacies written in the heavens long before their ancestors were even created. One such legacy centered on the children born from unions between Anunnaki and humans. These beings, neither fully divine nor fully mortal, played extraordinary roles in shaping early civilizations. In Sumer, they became kings who ruled for unnatural lengths of time, reigns so long that later scribes struggled to record them without suspecting exaggeration. In Egypt, they formed the earliest dynasties, remembered as followers of Horus, who governed before the first human pharaoh ascended the throne. In the Levant, they appeared as giants, warriors, and wise men whose presence ignited fear and reverence. Their abilities, strength, height, intelligence, intuition, set them apart. But their mixed essence also made them unstable. Some inherited divine longevity, others burned out quickly under the strain of their hybrid nature. Their existence alone was enough to upset the cosmic balance. Enlil despised these hybrids, believing they blurred the boundaries between creator and created. To him, they represented a violation of celestial order, a dangerous mixing of destinies. Ea, however, saw them as necessary bridges, proof that the life of Earth and the life of Nibiru could coexist. His perspective was shaped by compassion for humans and by remorse for the suffering they had endured. The hybrids, though controversial, represented a future where humanity might inherit knowledge once reserved exclusively for the gods. But Marduk saw them differently. To him, the hybrids were tools, legions of potential supporters who could be shaped into an earthly army capable of elevating him to the supremacy he believed was his birthright. He trained them, empowered them, and sometimes manipulated them, binding them to his star-aligned destiny. In this, he found both loyalty and disaster. For every hybrid who followed him willingly, another rebelled. their unstable nature turning them into unpredictable forces. Some became protectors of cities, others became tyrants or destroyers. Their actions fed the myths of angels, demons, giants, heroes, and monsters, stories later woven into religious texts, but rooted in the very real interplay between human and divine genetics. As hybrid lineages spread, so did the influence of celestial knowledge. Early astronomer priests, often themselves descended from hybrid bloodlines, carefully tracked the heavens from ziggurats, pyramids, and mountaintop observatories. They recorded the movement of planets with precision that modern science only rediscovered millennia later. They aligned temples with solstices, equinoxes, and star risings. They encoded mathematical principles into architecture, preserving a silent language of numbers that revealed the secrets of cosmic cycles. To ordinary people, these astronomer priests seemed like magicians. But in truth, they were simply custodians of knowledge left behind by beings who understood the mechanics of the universe in ways humans could barely comprehend. Ea warned the scribe that knowledge without wisdom was a double-edged blade. The cultures that flourished after the flood grew in strength, wealth, and complexity. Cities like Uruk, Ur, Babylon, Thebes, Memphis, and Mohenjo-Daro became centers of innovation. But as they expanded, so did their appetite for power. Kings sought divine legitimacy through rituals, omens, and alliances with priesthoods. Armies marched in the names of gods whose own agendas were often hidden from the humans who served them. And when celestial cycles signaled the approach of omens, eclipses, comets, planetary conjunctions, entire nations trembled, believing the fate of the world hung upon how their priests interpreted the sky. It was during this era that Ea revealed to the scribe the existence of a celestial pattern known only to the High Council of Nibiru. This pattern, encoded in the long orbit of their home world, predicted not only environmental shifts, but also cycles of conflict and harmony across the solar system. Every time Nibiru reached certain points in its orbit, gravitational forces interacted with other planets, creating atmospheric disturbances, geomagnetic fluctuations, and dramatic shifts in climate. These events affected not only Nibiru, but Earth as well. Ancient catastrophes, great floods, rapid climate changes, mass migrations often coincided with Nibiru's passing. Ea believed humanity needed to know this truth. He feared that without understanding the cycles, future civilizations would be blindsided by disasters they could have foreseen. But not all the gods wanted this knowledge revealed. Enlil argued that humans were not prepared to understand the scale of these cycles. He feared that awareness of celestial patterns would lead to panic, rebellion, or hubris. If humans believed they could predict or influence the movements of the heavens, they might begin to see the gods as vulnerable. And if they saw the gods as vulnerable, they might refuse their authority altogether. This fear drove Enlil to suppress certain astronomical teachings, forbidding priests from passing them down except in symbolic, mythologized forms. Only select initiates were allowed into the deeper mysteries, and even they were bound by oaths that carried the threat of divine punishment. This schism between knowledge and control created a strange tension across the ancient world. In some cities, astronomy flourished openly. In others, it was hidden behind layers of ritual and secrecy. In still others, it was forbidden entirely. Yet no matter how carefully the gods sought to control humanity's understanding, the sky remained visible to all. Anyone who looked upward could see the slow dance of stars, the bright wanderings of planets, the sudden blaze of comets. And from these silent movements, humans drew their own conclusions. The rise of great ancient libraries, carved tablets stored in temples, scrolls kept in palace archives, codices hidden in remote monasteries, reflected humanity's determination to preserve and expand their knowledge. Some of these libraries were created under divine guidance. Others were built in defiance of it, but all of them carried fragments of truths that would one day ignite profound discoveries. Ea took pride in the resilience of humanity. He told the scribe that humans possessed an innate curiosity more powerful than any decree issued by the gods. Even when forbidden, the pursuit of knowledge continued. Even when cities fell, survivors carried fragments of wisdom across mountains and deserts. Even when priesthoods were destroyed, their records resurfaced centuries later in unexpected places. Knowledge, he said, was like water. It always found a way. Yet the gods who remained on Earth grew increasingly uneasy. They saw how quickly humans learned, how fiercely they questioned, how readily they challenged old beliefs. And in their unease, they turned toward strategies of control that relied not on wisdom, but on fear. Enlil's priesthood introduced rituals that cast the gods as harsh judges, emphasizing obedience over curiosity. Sacrifices became more frequent. Omens were interpreted with increasing severity. Kings claimed divine mandates to expand their territories, believing they were fulfilling celestial prophecies. Wars that once centered around resources now revolved around ideology, whose god was superior, whose temple was older, whose lineage was more sacred. These conflicts echoed the rivalries of the gods themselves, fracturing the ancient world along lines drawn millennia earlier. Meanwhile, Marduk maneuvered with relentless determination. His influence spread across Babylon, sweeping through temples, councils, and schools. His priests developed astronomical tables that predicted lunar and planetary movements with astonishing accuracy. They proclaimed these predictions as signs of Marduk's supremacy. They rewrote genealogies to place him at the apex of creation. They constructed ziggurats so tall they seemed to scrape the heavens, monuments meant to demonstrate both human ingenuity and divine power. Other gods, threatened by Marduk's rise, sought to counterbalance his growing influence. Inanna forged alliances among cities loyal to her. Utu strengthened the priesthood of Sippar, spreading teachings related to justice, light, and divine law. Ninhursag withdrew to remote sanctuaries, offering counsel only to those who sought healing, for she feared the world was preparing for another cycle of destruction. Even Enki, Ea himself, felt the pressure mounting. Though he avoided direct confrontation, he continued guiding humanity in subtle ways, planting seeds of wisdom in minds capable of carrying them forward. But the inevitability that hung over this era was not merely political. It was cosmic. The heavens were shifting again. Celestial bodies aligned in patterns not seen since the ancient calamities. Comets with long, luminous tails re-entered the inner solar system. The moon displayed unusual cycles, inspiring priests to record anomalies in their astronomical tablets. Earth herself trembled with subtle changes, fluctuations in climate, unseasonal floods, strange weather patterns. The gods recognized these signs with dread. The last time such alignments occurred, entire civilizations were wiped out. Humans, sensing something was coming but unaware of its true nature, interpreted the omens through their own mythologies. Some believed a new golden age was approaching. Others feared judgment. Stories spread of gods descending in fire, carrying scales to weigh the souls of mortals. Prophets arose in marketplaces and temples, preaching visions of restoration or doom. For the first time since the flood, humanity felt the presence of destiny pressing upon them with a force that could not be ignored. Ea told the scribe that these cycles were not punishment, but consequence, the natural rhythms of a cosmos far older than any single species. Planets drifted along paths carved by gravity, time, and motion long before life existed on Earth. Stars pulsed with rhythms that shaped the rise and fall of civilizations. Cosmic dust streams triggered environmental changes. Solar cycles influenced climate. Even the tilt of Earth shifted subtly over millennia, altering the course of seasons and shaping human history in ways few understood. But the gods, in their pride, had always believed they could control these forces, or at least predict them with certainty. When they realized they could not, they panicked. Their panic drove them to decisions that would reshape the ancient world. Some of the Anunnaki prepared to flee, fearing a repetition of the disasters that once destroyed Sumer. Others planned to ascend to positions of dominance before the cycle reached its peak. Some sought to destroy rival factions. Others sought to crown new kings. Every god acted according to their interpretation of the signs, but few acted with wisdom. For humanity, the consequences were profound. Wars intensified, kingdoms fractured. Some cities experienced sudden prosperity as trade flourished under divine patronage. Others crumbled under starvation, drought, or invasion. The ancient world's stability cracked, giving way to an age where truth and myth became indistinguishable. And yet, through this turbulence, something extraordinary happened. Humans began to step into the role Ea always believed they were meant to inherit. They recorded knowledge not just in clay, but in stone, papyrus, and metal. They studied the heavens with increasing sophistication. They learned to build ships capable of navigating oceans. They explored lands their ancestors had never seen. They created art, literature, mathematics, and architecture that reflected not divine dictates but human imagination. For the first time, humanity moved through history not as pawns in divine struggles, but as authors of their own destiny. Ea's final words to the scribe in this chapter of the account carried a quiet intensity, that humanity's true test had not yet begun. The cycles would return. The heavens would shift again. And when they did, the world would face another turning of the great wheel. Whether humanity rose or fell this time would depend not on the gods, but on the choices of men. Choices made with knowledge carved from the ruins of forgotten ages. The scribe carved these words into stone, sealing them in a chamber meant to withstand the collapses of civilizations. For Ea wanted one truth to survive above all others. The past does not die. It waits, it returns, and those who learn its patterns may one day stand not beneath the will of gods, but beside the stars themselves. In the centuries that followed the rise and fall of early post-flood kingdoms, the world entered an era where memory dimmed, but echoes persisted. The gods had withdrawn from open rule, but their legacy, engraved into the genetics of humankind, encoded in the celestial lore of priesthoods, and embedded in the architecture of ancient cities, continued shaping every generation. Humans believed they were carving new civilizations from the dust of forgotten ages, yet the foundations on which they built ran far deeper than they understood. Beneath the surface of new empires, beneath the markets, palaces, and temples they raised, lay layers of older civilizations, each reflecting the fingerprints of beings who once walked the earth like lords of fate. Eye explained to the scribe that this era, though seemingly peaceful, was a time of unpredictable realignments. Like the deep currents beneath a calm sea, forces both cosmic and terrestrial moved silently, gradually, preparing to collide. Humans lived under the illusion of stability, but the gods knew that the cycles governing the heavens would soon return to a critical turning point. The celestial signs, subtle shifts in the movements of planets, faint disturbances in the magnetic fields of Earth, the appearance of unusual comets in the night sky, were warnings. The last time these omens appeared, entire civilizations were erased. The gods understood this. Humans, without the ancient knowledge suppressed by priesthoods, did not. But the heavens were not the only source of danger. As the gods withdrew, humanity began to fill the vacuum of power they left behind. Kings who once claimed divine mandate now grounded their authority in conquest, wealth, trade, and knowledge. They looked to the stars not only for omens, but for patterns they could manipulate, believing the sky itself could be deciphered like a coded message. And in their search for understanding, they sometimes stumbled upon remnants of knowledge the gods had tried to bury. Across the ancient world, pockets of secret knowledge survived. Fragments of cosmic science, genetic lore, and technological memory preserved by small groups who passed their teachings from generation to generation. Some of these groups were the remnants of hybrid lineages, whose unique intellect made them repositories of ancient truth. Others were priestly families who had hidden scrolls, tablets, or oral traditions forbidden by the dominant priesthoods aligned with Enlil. Still others were wanderers, mystics, astronomers, or displaced sages who carried scattered pieces of the past like embers kept alive through exile. These scattered groups became the seeds of future mysteries, the keepers of the Book of Enoch, the teachers behind the oldest Vedic hymns, the builders who preserved pre-dynastic Egyptian knowledge, the astronomers who passed down secrets of the Dogon, the scribes who guarded fragments of the Babylonian star tables. Each group held a sliver of the ancient truth. None possessed the whole. And as the centuries turned, the gods realized that humanity's rediscovery of these fragments could spark a new era, one either of enlightenment or of ruin. Ea observed these developments with wary hope. He believed humans could rise above the errors of the gods, but he also knew that humanity's thirst for power mirrored the ambition that had once torn Nibiru apart. Too much knowledge too quickly could lead to catastrophic misuse. Too little knowledge, on the other hand, left humans vulnerable to manipulation and caught in cycles of war and superstition. The balance was delicate, easily destroyed. It was during this delicate era that the great ancient migrations began. Civilizations shifted like tectonic plates. Some sought new lands as populations grew. Others were displaced by droughts, floods, or changes in climate. Still others followed visions or prophecies, believing their destinies lay beyond their ancestral homes. And as these migrations unfolded, the memory of the gods spread with them, sometimes in pure form, sometimes distorted, sometimes woven into new mythologies that blended celestial origins with local history. In the far west, travelers brought stories of shining beings descending from the sky, whom later cultures would remember as the feathered serpent gods. In the north, tribes carried tales of giants who shaped mountains and plains before withdrawing into mists. In Africa, legends preserved memories of beings who came from the sky in a time before time, teaching agriculture, astronomy, and metallurgy. In Asia, myths of sky chariots and celestial wars filtered into the earliest epics, reflecting battles that once raged not on Earth, but far beyond it. Across the Pacific, islanders preserved memories of star-born ancestors who navigated oceans using knowledge of cosmic cycles. These stories were not inventions, but memories softened by time. EA emphasized this to the scribe. Humans do not invent myths out of nothing. They reshape memory into narrative. They compress cosmic history into gods and monsters. They distill ancient truths into rituals and festivals. And though their understanding changes, the core of the story, the cosmic origins, the wars of the gods, the genetic shaping of humanity, remains embedded within the myths like seeds waiting for the right season to sprout. Yet while humanity spread these memories across the earth, the gods saw their own influence waning. The few who remained on earth faced a dilemma: reveal themselves and intervene, risking renewed devastation, or remain hidden and let humanity forge its own path. Enlil chose withdrawal. He retreated to high sanctuaries, interacting only with his most loyal priesthoods. Inanna continued playing political games through alliances with cities and kingdoms, though her influence diminished as humans began worshipping local rulers as divine. Utu preserved the Temple of Justice in Sippar, but visited it less frequently. Ninhursag faded into legends of mother goddesses who nurtured creation from behind the scenes. Only Ea remained actively engaged, though not openly. He moved quietly, guiding select individuals with dreams, visions, and intuition. He whispered insights into the minds of those capable of carrying knowledge without misusing it. He inspired the architects of megalithic sites whose alignments encoded ancient celestial science. He nudged seers and poets to preserve truths in symbolic form. He influenced healers and sages to maintain fragments of genetic and herbal knowledge that would one day evolve into medicine. His presence was subtle, but it was constant. It was during this period of hidden influence that one of the profound shifts in human history occurred: the emergence of rulers who claimed not descent from gods, but identity with them. These rulers, warriors, conquerors, ambitious leaders, began to declare themselves divine incarnations. They placed themselves at the center of creation myths. They demanded worship explicitly. They rewrote cosmic histories to elevate their bloodlines. This trend appeared in Egypt, Sumer, Mesoamerica, East Asia, and even Europe in different forms. Though the details varied, the underlying pattern was identical. Humans claimed the authority once reserved for their creators. EA explained that this was both inevitable and dangerous. Inevitable because humanity was genetically crafted to evolve, innovate, and seek autonomy. Dangerous because self-proclaimed divinity often masked unrestrained ambition. When humans claimed the mantle of the gods, they repeated the same cycles that had torn Nibiru apart, cycles of envy, rivalry, and war. Indeed, the wars of this era took on a new intensity. Armies grew larger, organized, and more ruthless. Sieges lasted years, cities were burned repeatedly, entire regions were depopulated. Conquests stretched across thousands of miles. Some rulers attempted to unify the known world under a single banner, believing they were fulfilling destiny. Others resisted with equal ferocity, invoking their own divine right to rule. But the most dangerous developments were technological. As cultures exchanged knowledge, mathematics, metallurgy, astronomy, navigation, they inadvertently reconstructed fragments of the science once used by the gods. Bronze tools gave way to iron. Rudimentary medicine grew more sophisticated. Early machines appeared: water wheels, pumps, siege engines, tools that harnessed wind and hydraulics. Though primitive by Anunnaki standards, these developments marked a critical turning point. Humans were no longer dependent on divine intervention for innovation. This shift alarmed certain gods, especially those aligned with Enlil. They feared that human advancement would eventually allow mortals to challenge divine authority. They tried to slow progress by enforcing strict religious doctrines, suppressing forbidden knowledge, burning libraries, and punishing those who delved too deeply into astronomy or engineering. But knowledge, once ignited, does not die easily. Even burned libraries left traces of the minds of those who had once walked their halls. Even suppressed teaching survived in coded texts passed from master to apprentice. Even forbidden sciences reappeared in distant lands, reframed as new discoveries. Ea knew that humanity had entered a threshold that could not be reversed. They were becoming what they had been designed to become: creators in their own right. But with creation came the old danger: division. As humans grew more capable, their rivalries expanded. They no longer fought only with swords and chariots. They fought with culture, ideology, religion, and systems of government. They forged alliances across oceans. They created networks of trade and diplomacy that mirrored the political complexity of the gods themselves. It was during this era that a new phenomenon emerged: secret societies. These were not the conspiratorial orders later imagined by modern minds, but early assemblies formed to preserve ancient knowledge. Some were founded by hybrid descendants who carried fragments of celestial memory. Others were formed by priests who had uncovered forbidden texts. Still others were created by rulers seeking to maintain an advantage over rivals by hoarding scientific and astronomical knowledge. These groups encrypted their teachings in symbols, monuments, and rituals. They built underground chambers and star-aligned temples where initiates learned the deeper meanings behind myths. Some societies preserved truth. Others distorted it. Some sought wisdom. Others sought power. But all of them carried echoes of Ea's teachings, knowledge that would outlast empires. As centuries passed, the gods continued fading. Their visits grew rare. Their names transformed into cultural symbols rather than literal beings. Stories of their wars became myths of divine battles. Their technologies became legends of magical objects. Their genetic shaping of humanity became allegories of creation. Over time, the boundary between memory and myth dissolved. Yet the heavens did not forget. The cosmic cycles continued turning. Subtle changes appeared again, changes that mirrored the events preceding previous catastrophes. Ea warned the scribe that these cycles were not random. They were rooted in the same gravitational forces that shaped Nibiru's orbit. When the heavens aligned in certain patterns, energy fields shifted across the solar system. Planets trembled, climates changed, civilization faced upheaval. And now the signs were returning. Some gods prepared themselves. Those who remained on Earth hid in deep chambers, protected by ancient technologies. Those who returned to Nibiru monitored the cycle from afar. Those who had severed ties with their people watched silently, uncertain whether to intervene. Marduk interpreted the cycle as the herald of his long-awaited rise. Enlil saw it as a warning. Inanna saw it as an opportunity. Ea saw it as the moment humanity would finally choose its own destiny. And humanity, unaware of the cosmic storm approaching, continued building empires that believed themselves eternal. Ea ended this portion of his dictation with a solemn truth. Civilizations rise not because they are destined to rise, but because they survive the storms of the heavens. And just as the last cycle brought flood and fire, the next cycle would bring trials that would test humanity's resilience, courage, and wisdom. Whether the species he helped create would endure this next turning, he did not know. But he hoped, quietly, fiercely, that humanity, shaped by catastrophe and strengthened by knowledge, would stand not as subjects of gods, but as children of earth prepared to inherit the stars. For the cycles would return. And when they did, the past would rise with them. In the long arc of human civilization, there are ages that leave monuments, ages that leave ruins, and ages that leave questions so deep they feel like wounds in the record of time. The era that followed the quiet withdrawal of the gods was one of these wounded ages, an epoch defined by absence, yet shaped by shadows of an earlier world that refused to fade. To later historians, it would appear as a burst of creativity from civilizations suddenly eager to define themselves. But Ea told the scribe that underneath this surge in human innovation lay a profound truth. Humanity was trying to fill a void left behind by beings who had once been the architects of their destiny. The absence of the divine created both liberation and longing, both genius and desperation, both unity and division. And from these opposing forces rose empires whose ambitions rivaled those of the gods who once ruled them. As the gods retreated, they left behind technologies buried beneath sand, stone, and myth. They left behind genetic legacies embodied in hybrid lineages scattered across regions that would later become cradles of civilization. They left behind celestial knowledge encoded in temples aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and star risings. Above all, they left behind stories carried through priesthoods, carved into tablets, woven into epics, whispered through secret societies, preserved in symbols etched on megaliths. These stories were sometimes understood, sometimes corrupted, sometimes feared, but always powerful. They connected the visible world to the invisible forces that shaped it. In this shifting landscape, new powers rose in regions once overshadowed by the authority of the gods. In Mesopotamia, Babylon sought to reinvent itself, turning Marduk's memory into a unifying cosmic narrative. In Egypt, pharaohs claimed the right to rule not because the gods lived among them, but because the gods had once chosen their bloodline. In Persia, kings justified conquest by framing themselves as chosen by a cosmic order older than time. In Greece, philosophers replaced divine command with inquiry, but their cosmologies still bore the fingerprints of a world crafted by celestial beings. In China, sages spoke of heavenly mandates, cycles of order and chaos, and rulers whose authority was tied to harmony between heaven and earth. In the Americas, civilizations charted celestial alignments with precision rooted in memories brought across oceans by wandering descendants of ancient teachers. Even in regions where written histories would not appear for centuries, oral traditions preserved astonishing detail. Stories of sky beings, cataclysms, ancient wars, and migrations guided by stars. Humanity, scattered and diverse, carried fragments of a cosmic mosaic whose full picture had been lost. Eo told the scribe that this fragmentation was inevitable. Knowledge spreads unevenly, memory warps, languages evolve. Myths fuse with local landscapes. But even fragmented truth carries weight. And in some places, these fragments crystallized into institutions with influence powerful enough to reshape the world. One such institution arose in the shadow of ancient Sumer, the priesthoods who preserved forbidden astronomical knowledge. They charted the movements of planets, predicted eclipses, studied the precession of the equinoxes, and attempted to rebuild the celestial science once used by the gods. Though they understood only a fraction of what the Anunnaki had known, they elevated themselves above kings through their ability to interpret the heavens. Some used this knowledge to guide rulers wisely. Others manipulated it for political gain. Ea feared the latter, because misinterpreted knowledge could be more dangerous than ignorance. Another institution emerged in Egypt, where the memory of the gods lingered longest. Here, the blending of human and divine continued symbolically, even when the literal presence of the gods faded. The pharaohs became living bridges between heaven and earth, and the temples became repositories of encoded knowledge that survived through ritual rather than text. Astronomers aligned pyramids with Orion's belt, Sirius, and the cardinal directions, preserving cosmic maps older than their civilization. Priests guarded secret chambers filled with scrolls, stones, and devices inherited from earlier ages. Yet even in Egypt, political upheaval and shifting dynasties fractured the continuity of this ancient truth. Sometimes the knowledge resurfaced through visionary leaders. Sometimes it sank into forgotten chambers beneath drifting sands. Further east, the Indus Valley civilization preserved a different strand of memory, one shaped by teachings brought by visitors who descended in machines blazing like fire, and taught cycles of creation and destruction spanning billions of years. Their texts, later absorbed into Vedic tradition, described cosmic ages called yugas, epochs of rise and fall reminiscent of the cycles Ea explained. Within their hymns were references to sky chariots, celestial weapons, and beings whose lifespans dwarfed those of mortals. Though scholars would later interpret these as metaphors, the scribe knew they were echoes of real events. Across the Mediterranean, civilizations rose with astonishing speed. The Greeks, whose myths blended human curiosity with divine conflict, inherited remnants of older Near Eastern teachings. Their oldest mysteries, taught in caves, forests, and hidden temples, preserved fragments of Anunnaki lore under new symbols. Zeus resembled Enlil. Poseidon resembled Ea. Prometheus resembled a rebellious god who gave forbidden knowledge to humanity. Even Hercules echoed tales of hybrid beings who performed extraordinary feats. But Greek thought took a new direction. It embraced the idea that the universe could be understood not only through myth but through reason. Though incomplete, their inquiries into geometry, astronomy, and natural law pushed humanity toward a new kind of knowledge built not on divine command, but on observation. As these civilizations grew, So did the geopolitical tensions that shaped the ancient world. But the most profound shift occurred when emerging kingdoms began competing not just for land and wealth, but for cosmic legitimacy. Kings, priests, and conquerors sought to tie themselves to the celestial order. They built temples aligned with stars, claimed prophecies that linked their destinies to planetary cycles, and commissioned scribes to rewrite genealogies that traced their ancestry to gods or hybrids. This race for cosmic legitimacy ignited wars that spanned thousands of miles. In Mesopotamia, Babylon sought to dominate by declaring Marduk the supreme god of heaven. In Egypt, dynasties claimed their rule was ordained by solar cycles. In Persia, kings invoked the sacred fire to prove their connection to cosmic truth. In Greece and later Rome, leaders adopted divine titles to strengthen loyalty. Everywhere, the memory of the gods became a tool for earthly power. But while humans fought for supremacy under the symbols of gods, the actual gods, those few who remained, watched with growing unease. They saw in humanity the same patterns that had once torn their own world apart. Ambition eclipsed wisdom. Rivalry overshadowed cooperation. Conquest replaced harmony. The gods had hoped humanity would rise above these cycles. Instead, humanity inherited them. And yet, amidst the wars and empires, humanity also produced brilliance. Engineers constructed aqueducts, pyramids, roads, gardens, towers, and observatories. Mathematicians devised systems capable of describing the movements of stars. Philosophers dissected the nature of existence. Doctors recorded treatments passed down from forgotten healers. Sailors navigated oceans using stellar maps, eerily similar to those once traced by Anunnaki astronomers. EA believed these achievements reflected humanity's greatest gift, not strength, longevity, or obedience, but adaptability. Humans learned quickly, innovated fearlessly, and persevered through catastrophe after catastrophe. No other species the gods had encountered possessed this resilience. It was both humanity's salvation and its danger. But the true turning point of this era was not a king, empire, or invention. It was the rise of a phenomenon the scribe recorded with trembling hands, the reawakening of forgotten sites. Across the world, ancient structures began revealing secrets long hidden from view. In Mesopotamia, archaeologists of their time uncovered tablets older than the flood, inscribed with knowledge once thought lost. In Egypt, shifts in the desert exposed long-buried chambers aligned with constellations. In the Americas, explorers stumbled upon massive stone calendars tracking celestial cycles with impossible precision. In Asia, ancient star maps resurfaced, describing cosmic events that predated recorded history. In Europe, megalithic sites revealed astronomical alignments far more sophisticated than their builders were believed capable of understanding. These discoveries stirred fear among the remaining gods. They realized humanity was piecing together the past. They knew that if humans reconstructed the full truth about the genetic shaping, the celestial wars, the cosmic cycles, they might see through the myths that had controlled them for ages. And once they saw through those myths, no priesthood or god could control them again. Enlil, still watching from distant sanctuaries, urged the last loyal priesthoods to conceal or destroy these discoveries. Some complied, burning scrolls, sealing chambers, or spreading counter-narratives to obscure the truth. But knowledge is like water. The more tightly one tries to grip it, the more swiftly it escapes. Every destroyed library left behind memories. Every forbidden text inspired seekers. Every sealed chamber awakened curiosity. Ea, conversely, welcomed humanity's rediscovery. He believed the time had come for humans to assume stewardship of Earth without divine oversight. The gods had shaped the early path of civilization, but their era was ending. The next age belonged to humans alone. But he also knew that humanity's ascent came with risks. The rediscovered knowledge could lead to enlightenment, or it could ignite a new cycle of destruction resembling the wars that once ravaged both Nibiru and Earth. This tension reached its peak when certain priesthoods, seeking to consolidate power, began blending fragments of ancient truth with political ideology. They claimed exclusive custodianship over cosmic knowledge. They declared rival teachings heretical. They reconstructed creation myths in ways that served their agendas. They created doctrines that turned the memory of the gods into rigid systems of belief rather than dynamic histories. As these doctrines spread, civilizations found themselves divided not by territory but by ideology. In some regions, monotheism rose, a belief in a single supreme creator distilled from fragments of various divine lineages. In others, polytheism persisted, with gods assigned roles that echoed earlier celestial functions. In still others, philosophical systems emerged that replaced gods with cosmic principles. Humanity's spiritual landscape fractured into countless paths, each carrying shadows of the gods but none preserving the full truth. This fragmentation, Ea told the scribe, was both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because diversity allowed humanity to explore multiple paths toward understanding. Dangerous because division could lead to new wars that might surpass the destruction of earlier ages. As centuries passed, the gods faded into the background of myth. Marduk's attempts to assert supremacy waned as Babylon fell to rising empires. Inanna's influence collapsed as her cults fractured and her symbols were absorbed into new religions. Utu's role as a solar deity merged into broader myths about light, justice, and kingship. Enlil's stern authority dissolved into stories of storm gods found across the world. Even Ea's memory dimmed, though his teachings survived through symbols associated with water, wisdom, and creation. Yet the cosmic cycles Ea warned about continued turning. Astronomers observed the slow precession of the equinoxes. Priests recorded unusual conjunctions. Comets with long tails reappeared. Stars shifted positions. Earth's climate changed subtly. These changes sparked new prophecies, some hopeful, others apocalyptic. And amid these changes, humanity's empires began collapsing under their own weight. Rome, once seemingly eternal, fractured. Egypt, after millennia of continuity, fell repeatedly. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, became a battlefield. India experienced cycles of unification and fragmentation. China rose, fell, and rose again. Across the Americas, great cities were abandoned. Everywhere the story was the same. Civilizations rose to astonishing heights, only to fail when they drifted too far from balance, just as Nibiru once had. Ayat explained to the scribe that the collapse of civilizations was not merely political. It was part of a cosmic rhythm. When knowledge grew too fast without wisdom, collapse followed. When power concentrated too heavily, collapse followed. When cultures lost connection to the cycles of the heavens, collapse followed. And each collapse created space for a new civilization to rise on the ruins of the old. This was the great cycle, the pulse of history itself, echoing the heartbeat of cosmic forces that shaped both gods and mortals. But Ea also foresaw something unprecedented. He believed that one day humanity would not merely rise after collapse, but transcend the cycle entirely. He believed humanity carried within them the potential to break the ancient pattern, to rise into an age not of gods, not of empires, but of understanding. He spoke of a future where humans would rediscover the forgotten sciences, not through divine instruction, but through their own observation and intuition. He envisioned a time when humans would look beyond Earth, exploring the cosmos that once brought the gods to them. He foresaw an age when the boundary between myth and science would dissolve, revealing truths that had been hidden for millennia. He hoped that when the next cosmic cycle aligned, humanity would face it not as fearful subjects, but as knowledgeable beings capable of shaping their own fate. And so he entrusted his teachings to the scribe, carving them into tablets designed to survive catastrophe, war, and time. He believed those tablets would one day be found by a generation ready to understand them, for Ea's final message in this chapter was clear. The gods are gone, but their shadows remain. The cycles continue, but humanity can learn their pattern. The past sleeps, but it will wake. And when it does, humanity must be ready, not to repeat the history of the gods, but to transcend it. As humanity continued to build, expand, and dream, believing itself to be the rightful steward of a world no longer ruled by gods, the echoes of earlier ages stirred beneath the soil, in the archives of fading kingdoms, and in the minds of those born with a sensitivity that others could not comprehend. These echoes were not merely stories or memories. They were signals woven into the fabric of Earth itself. Ea told the scribe that no civilization truly begins on a blank slate. Every era rises from the rubble of the last, inheriting scars, knowledge, and patterns that linger far beyond the collapse of cities or the deaths of kings. In this eighth great turning of the narrative, humanity unknowingly began walking toward a precipice shaped by decisions made thousands of years before their time. Decisions that once belonged to the gods, but were now passing silently into human hands. The world had entered an age of expansion unlike anything seen since the first post-flood civilizations of Sumer and Egypt. Trade routes stretched across continents. Ships explored coasts and islands previously believed unreachable. Empires sought to unify vast populations under a single banner. In the Mediterranean, powerful city-states fought for control of seas and markets. In Asia, dynasties built walls, canals, and palaces intended to last longer than memory. In Africa, kingdoms carved their stories into stone. Across the Americas, cultures constructed massive temples, calendars, and observatories that tracked the stars with precision reminiscent of ancient sky watchers who learned from the Anunnaki themselves. But beneath these achievements lay subtle imbalances. He warned that civilizations often collapse not during times of weakness, but during times of overreaching strength, when ambition grows faster than wisdom, when expansion outpaces stability, when leaders believe they can succeed where gods themselves once failed. Humanity, in its fervor to shape the world, began repeating patterns etched into their nature by ancient hands. One of the most telling signs of this repetition was the resurgence of hybrid lineages. Though the direct descendants of Anunnaki human unions had dwindled, diluted across generations, their genetic influence remained. Individuals with unusual intuition, high intelligence, extraordinary physical resilience, or uncanny sensitivity to celestial cycles began appearing in scattered regions. These individuals often rose to positions of leadership, scholarship, or spiritual authority. Some became kings who built monumental architecture aligned with the movements of the sky. Others became sages who decoded ancient texts or rediscovered mathematical principles once known only to the gods. Still others became warriors with reputations so intimidating they entered legend as demigods long after their deaths. These individuals did not realize they carried remnants of celestial origins, remnants that amplified both their brilliance and their flaws. Just as the hybrid beings of the ancient world struggled with instability, modern hybrids wrestled with extremes of emotion, ambition, and spiritual longing. They felt compelled to achieve greatness, yet haunted by a sense of incompleteness. Some rose to wisdom. Others fell to madness. Many became catalysts, sparks that ignited revolutions, philosophical movements, or religious awakenings. Ea feared this resurgence could lead humanity down a dangerous path. The gods had once fought over hybrid lineages, believing their existence threatened the order of both Earth and Nibiru. Now humanity risked repeating the same pattern without understanding its origin. But unlike the gods, humans lacked the perspective of thousands of years. They had not witnessed the cycles of destruction that followed each era of hybrid prominence. They saw only the brilliance, not the danger. Yet the danger was not limited to genetics. Another force was stirring, one deeply tied to the cosmic cycles Ea described. The heavens were shifting again. Ancient astronomers had once tracked these cycles with instruments crafted under divine guidance. Now, using simpler tools but profound intuition, human astronomers began noticing anomalies. The precession of the equinoxes, once a mystical concept reserved for elite priesthoods, became a measurable phenomenon. Eclipses were predicted with increasing accuracy. Planetary movements were charted with mathematical models echoing ancient star tables. Comets appeared in regular intervals, leaving behind stories that blended myth and observation. These celestial developments inspired awe in some cultures, fear in others, and opportunism in many. Kings consulted astronomers before marching into battle. Priests interpreted planetary alignments as omens of divine approval or judgment. Traders followed star paths to access new markets. Poets wrote epics linking the destinies of nations to the movements of constellations. And in remote regions, small groups of mystics began piecing together fragments of ancient knowledge, realizing slowly, with growing dread, that Earth was approaching another turning of the great cycle. Ea said that this recognition, partial, scattered, inconsistent, was both promising and perilous. Promising because it demonstrated humanity's growing capacity to perceive the cosmos independently of divine guidance. Perilous because without understanding the deeper mechanics of the cycle, humans might react with panic, superstition, or misguided attempts to control forces far beyond their reach. During this same era, powerful empires rose whose ambitions rivaled the cosmic scale of the old wars between gods. Some sought to unify the world through conquest. Others sought to dominate trade or culture. Still others turned inward, building self-contained realms of philosophy, art, and ritual. In every case, the underlying motivations echoed the ambitions of Anunnaki factions thousands of years earlier. Where Enlil sought order through control, some empires imposed rigid legal systems. Where Inanna sought influence through charisma and conflict, some cultures glorified beauty, passion, and war. Where Marduk sought supremacy through cosmic prophecy, certain rulers declared themselves chosen by stars or destiny. And where Ea sought knowledge, some societies built academies, libraries, and observatories. Though humanity believed itself unique, the patterns of the gods lived on through their descendants. Yet what truly distinguished this era was the widespread emergence of hidden knowledge. Ancient scrolls resurfaced in buried libraries. Tablets excavated from ruins revealed stories of cataclysms, celestial visitors, and lost ages. Secret societies, some benign, some manipulative, claimed custodianship of forbidden truths. Travelers returned from distant lands carrying stories of temples older than memory, staircases carved into mountains without explanation, and tunnels illuminated by unknown means. The world, it seemed, was filled with artifacts that did not fit the timeline accepted by scholars and kings. Some of these artifacts were remnants of Anunnaki technology, broken, dormant, or misunderstood. Others were creations of hybrid engineers whose innovations surpassed the understanding of their time. Still others were products of civilizations lost to earlier catastrophes, civilizations wiped out by floods, volcanic eruptions, or cosmic events, but preserved in fragments awaiting rediscovery. EA warned that rediscovering lost knowledge could be both awakening and destructive. Knowledge empowers, but it also disrupts. Those who rediscovered fragments often interpreted them through the lens of their culture, projecting their own beliefs onto truths far older and broader than they realized. Misinterpretations became doctrines. Doctrines hardened into dogma. Dogma fueled conflict. One such misinterpretation involved creation itself. Diverse cultures, each carrying fragments of the original story, formed competing narratives about the origins of life. Some insisted humans were crafted by singular divine beings. Others believed humans emerged from cosmic forces. Still others blended these ideas into elaborate mythologies. Ea lamented that the truth, humans shaped through intentional design by celestial engineers using the genetic potential of Earth's early hominids, was too complex to survive unbroken across millennia. Instead, creation became a battleground of belief, with each group insisting its version was the only truth. This fragmentation of memory also affected humanity's understanding of morality. Ancient laws, once derived from a combination of divine decree and practical survival, evolved into intricate systems that sometimes contradicted their original intent. Priests argued over interpretations of old texts. Philosophers debated the nature of justice. Kings enforced laws shaped more by ambition than wisdom. In this chaos, many turned to secret traditions, mystical practices, or esoteric teachings that promised access to truth beyond the reach of political or religious institutions. EA watched this evolution with cautious hope. He believed humanity needed to break free from divine oversight in order to mature. But he also knew that without guidance, humanity could repeat ancient mistakes. Catastrophes born not from ignorance, but from pride. And then came the first tremors. Not physical tremors, but tremors of meaning, subtle signs that the cosmic cycle was nearing another critical point. Weather patterns shifted unpredictably. Certain regions experienced prolonged droughts, while others faced unseasonal floods. Earth's magnetic field fluctuated. Migratory animals altered their patterns. The auroras intensified. astronomers observed unusual solar activity. Priests revived ancient prophecies that spoke of an age of upheaval. In some cultures, these signs inspired fear. In others, they sparked movements of renewal. But in all cases, the world felt an approaching tension, a pressure building just beyond the threshold of human perception. Ea explained to the scribe that these signs were not the wrath of gods, nor punishments for moral failings, but symptoms of a cycle tied to the orbital rhythms of the solar system. Planets moved in long cycles that influenced Earth's climate, geology, and even the biological rhythms of life. When these cycles reached certain alignments, the world experienced accelerated change. Some ages were golden, others were catastrophic. Humanity, without the full archive of ancient knowledge, could not see the pattern. But the few surviving gods could. Some prepared to intervene if the cycle turned destructive. Others believed humanity must face the consequences alone. Still others hoped the cycle would pass with minimal disruption. But none, not even Ea, could predict its exact outcome. The universe, for all its patterns, preserved an element of unpredictability, a sliver of fate untouched by destiny. As the cycle approached its peak, humanity began experiencing visions, dreams filled with symbols of ancient cities, stars falling from the sky, oceans rising, or gods returning. These dreams occurred across cultures with no contact between them. Shamans, priests, and mystics described hearing voices from forgotten ages. Some interpreted these visions as warnings. Others saw them as promises. Many believed they were hallucinations. But Ea knew they were echoes, waves of memory triggered by cosmic forces stirring dormant patterns in the human mind. In one region, a young astronomer decoded an ancient cycle encoded in temple walls, realizing humanity was approaching a critical juncture. In another, a wandering sage revived forgotten teachings that spoke of a time when the heavens would shift and humanity would be tested. In yet another region, a king received a prophecy urging him to unify his people before the coming upheaval. These visions and messages, though scattered, were pieces of a larger truth. The world was entering another era of transformation. As humanity wrestled with these signs, the gods faced their own dilemma. Some believed they should remain hidden to avoid repeating past cycles of dominance and rebellion. Others argued for limited intervention, guidance without control. A few, influenced by ancient grudges, believed the coming cycle might restore their lost power. But Ea insisted that the era of divine rulers was over. The world belonged to humans now. The gods had shaped the early path, but they were not meant to be the architects of the final one. Yet he also knew that humanity could not survive the approaching cycle blindly. They needed knowledge, knowledge once suppressed, forgotten, or buried. Knowledge that explained the true nature of the heavens, the cycles of time, the patterns of collapse and renewal. Knowledge that could help them navigate the approaching storm, not through fear, but through understanding. And so, Ea called upon the scribe one final time in this chapter of the account. He dictated not warnings of doom or declarations of destiny, but principles. Principles humanity would need to endure the next great cycle. He spoke of the importance of balance between knowledge and humility. He emphasized the need to preserve truth even when empires fall. He warned against leaders who claim divine authority while misunderstanding the cosmos. He urged humanity to look to the stars, not for fear, but for guidance. He cautioned that cycles of catastrophe are not punishments, but opportunities for renewal. He taught that humanity's greatest strength is not power, but adaptability. He reminded that wisdom often comes from those outside thrones and temples. He insisted that the past must be studied not for nostalgia, but for survival. And he affirmed that the future is not predetermined. It is shaped by choices. These teachings, once carved into stone, would outlast the empires of the age. They would survive collapse, fire, and war. They would resurface in fragments, in myths, scriptures, philosophies, and scientific revolutions. And though humanity would forget their origin, the essence of Ea's teachings would guide generations through darkness and into light. For the cycle was approaching, the cosmos was shifting, and humanity stood at the threshold of an age that would test everything they had become. But Ea believed in them, not as servants or creations, but as heirs. The past was awakening, the heavens were aligning, and humanity, shaped by ancient hands yet guided by its own evolving spirit, was about to face its greatest turning yet. In the centuries that followed the rising tension of celestial signs, humanity moved steadily, unknowingly, toward a convergence. An era when memory, myth, science, prophecy, and the remnants of divine influence would collide in ways no civilization had ever been prepared to face. The eighth turning had awakened subtle forces across the world, but the ninth was the storm front approaching behind it, gathering momentum from ancient cycles that had shaped epochs long before humans carved cities into stone. Ea told the scribe that the ninth movement of history is often the most dangerous, a moment suspended between awakening and collapse, where civilizations either gain clarity or succumb to their own shadows. And as the world entered this phase, the echoes of the gods grew louder, not because they returned, but because everything they left behind began stirring at once. Humanity had reached a height of ambition unmatched by earlier eras. The libraries of powerful civilizations grew vast, filled with scrolls, tablets, codices, and star maps. Trade routes connected distant cultures, allowing knowledge to flow across mountains, deserts, and oceans. Scholars debated the nature of reality in marketplaces and courts. Engineers created machines that multiplied human labor. Navigators sailed by the stars with confidence. Architects constructed buildings that defied gravity, pointing skyward like fingers seeking lost heavens. Artists portrayed visions that felt ancient yet new, capturing the uneasy sense that humanity was standing at the edge of an age its ancestors had forgotten. But as these advancements spread, so did underlying instability. Empires expanded to their limits and strained under the weight of their own size. Populations grew rapidly, consuming resources faster than they could replenish them. Social hierarchies hardened, leaving many resentful and desperate. Religious institutions fractured into competing sects, each claiming access to the true cosmic history. Philosophers conflicted with priests. Kings mistrusted astronomers whose predictions contradicted ritual interpretations. Wars broke out not only for land or power, but for truths, each side claiming to preserve ancient knowledge while accusing the other of distorting it. Ea explained to the scribe that this fracturing was not random. It was a symptom of the cycle. As cosmic forces intensified, human consciousness became unsettled, agitated, more susceptible to visions, fears, and bursts of intuition. Dreams became vivid, prophecies multiplied, signs were seen in the skies, eclipses, comets, meteors, strange atmospheric lights. Animals behaved unusually. Crops flourished in some regions and failed in others. Earth itself seemed to tremble with anticipation. The gods, though distant, felt the pressure as well. Those few who remained in hidden sanctuaries sensed a familiar pattern, the beginning of an age when the heavens would reveal truths too powerful to ignore. One of the most dramatic manifestations of this shift was the rediscovery of ancient sites, structures buried by time, concealed by jungles, or submerged by rising seas. Explorers, guided by dreams or chance, uncovered chambers filled with symbols identical to those found in distant lands. Stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons revealed precision cutting that modern tools struggled to emulate. Temples aligned perfectly with constellations as they appeared thousands of years earlier, suggesting the builders possessed astronomical knowledge far beyond what orthodox histories claimed. Underground tunnels extended for miles beneath forgotten cities, their purposes lost. Strange alloys appeared in artifacts that did not match any known metallurgical technique of the era. Everywhere, the past seeped upward like a long-suppressed memory rising into the modern mind. These discoveries disturbed the priesthoods, whose authority rested on controlling the narrative of creation and divine order. They feared that the rediscovered truths dating back to the times when the gods walked openly on earth, would undermine their power. And so, many religious and political authorities began suppressing or destroying the evidence. Scrolls were burned, excavations were stopped, scholars were silenced, artifacts disappeared into vaults. But the more aggressively these institutions tried to hide the past, the more individuals became obsessed with finding it. This growing obsession spread like wildfire through scholars, mystics, rulers, merchants, and wanderers. Some believed they were uncovering the lost wisdom of ancestors. Others believed they were decoding messages left by beings from the stars. Others believed they were preparing for a coming age of transformation. And there were those who believed the rediscovered knowledge would grant them power to reshape the world in their image. EA warned the scribe that knowledge acquired without balance leads to ruin. When ancient truth becomes a tool for ambition, it ignites the same flames that once consumed Nibiru. This danger manifested vividly in the rise of new cults dedicated to celestial beings. Some worshipped the memory of Marduk, interpreting the return of certain stars as signs of his imminent resurrection. Others revived the traditions of Inanna, believing she would return to empower her followers in the next cosmic age. Still others reinterpreted Enlil as a stern cosmic judge whose era was returning. But the most concerning were cults claiming to receive revelations from hybrid descendants who believed themselves chosen to restore the old order of the gods. These cults built secret societies, conducted initiations, and created hierarchical systems reminiscent of divine courts. They used symbols traced back to ancient sites. They sought lost artifacts believed to hold divine power. They attempted to summon celestial forces through ritual. Some achieved genuine insights into forgotten truths. Others descended into manipulation, sacrifice, and fear. And a few succeeded in awakening forces they were not prepared to control. Parallel to these spiritual upheavals, scientific inquiry began advancing in unexpected directions. Scholars studying the heavens observed patterns in planetary motion that suggested cycles much longer than human memory, cycles corresponding to cataclysms described in myths across continents. Philosophers contemplating the nature of life speculated that humanity might be older than recorded history indicated. Physicians discovered anatomical details hinting that human origins were more complex than simple evolution. Engineers experimented with principles that resembled technologies described in ancient manuscripts. Artists depicted beings with elongated skulls, wings of fire, or eyes like stars, images eerily similar to descriptions found in pre-flood texts. He explained that this convergence of myth and science was inevitable. When the cycles align, the barriers between intuition and reason thin. Humans begin perceiving truths once hidden beneath layers of story. The cosmos whispers, and sensitive minds hear echoes of forgotten ages. Yet while some embraced these whispers with curiosity and humility, others reacted with fear. Institutions that had once promised stability, temples, universities, courts, empires, felt their foundations cracking. They responded by tightening their grip on information. They issued edicts forbidding certain types of research. They labeled new discoveries as heresy or treason. They demonized those who sought to understand the ancient past. But suppression could not stop the tide. It only forced knowledge into darker, more secretive channels. And so, humanity entered a twilight of truths, a period when knowledge and ignorance intertwined so tightly that most people could not distinguish revelation from illusion. Prophecy blended with astronomy, myth blended with geology, ritual blended with science. Dreams became indistinguishable from memories. EA told the scribe that during such eras, humanity reveals its true nature. Some rise to wisdom, some fall to madness. Most wander between the two, seeking meaning in the shifting ground of their age. At the same time, the earth itself began showing signs of the approaching cycle. Volcanoes erupted in unusual patterns, echoing ancient cataclysms recorded in tablets buried beneath Sumer. Earthquakes struck regions long considered stable. Seas advanced upon coastlines, swallowing villages and fields. Strange lights appeared in the night sky, auroras stretching far south, luminescent clouds glowing with electromagnetic charge, meteors leaving trails of green fire. Animals sensed the shift before humans did, migrating out of season, abandoning ancestral roots, or disappearing entirely. These changes triggered migrations on an unprecedented scale. People fled droughts, famines, floods, and wars. Populations shifted like waves across continents, carrying their stories, knowledge, and fears with them. Empires struggled to maintain order. Some collapsed under the strain. Others adapted, reshaping political systems to absorb displaced peoples. But in every case, the migrations intensified the flow of information across the ancient world. Myths once isolated to specific regions now spread globally, merging into hybrid traditions that preserved fragments of the truth more accurately than any single culture had done before. Among the migrating populations were individuals born with an unusual sensitivity to the cosmic cycle. Some had dreams of places they had never seen. Others felt drawn to ancient sites. Some experienced visions of past ages, cities of stone shining under alien suns, machines of light cutting through the sky, beings of immense stature walking among early humans. A few developed abilities that seemed supernatural: intuitive healing, uncanny foresight, or heightened perception. These individuals were descendants of ancient hybrids, carrying dormant traits awakened by the cosmic forces of the ninth turning. EA viewed these awakening traits as both blessing and risk. If guided properly, such individuals could lead humanity toward a deeper understanding of the cosmos. but if exploited, they could become instruments of domination. And in an age when kingdoms and cults sought any advantage, exploitation was inevitable. Meanwhile, the last remnants of the gods faced their own reckoning. Some withdrew even further, severing their influence entirely and fading into the hidden folds of time. Others watched with sorrow, realizing humanity was unprepared for the coming cycle, yet determined to face it alone. A few, influenced by old rivalries, considered using the cycle to regain their lost power. But Ea insisted that intervention would only repeat the tragedy of the earlier ages. Humanity needed to confront the cycle without divine interference, or else it would never mature beyond the shadow of its creators. And yet, he also knew that the scribes' recordings, buried in chambers designed to survive catastrophe, might one day be discovered by a generation capable of understanding them. These records, if interpreted correctly, could serve as guides through the coming transformation, but if misinterpreted, they could ignite conflict greater than any seen before. One of the most haunting predictions Ea gave during this period involved the possibility of convergence, a moment when remnants of the gods' ancient technologies might reactivate due to cosmic conditions. Some of these devices had been intentionally disabled after the flood. Others had simply decayed over millennia. But a few, buried deep beneath mountains or submerged beneath oceans, remained intact enough to respond to changes in electromagnetic or gravitational fields. If reactivated unintentionally, these machines could alter climates, trigger geological shifts, or disrupt the delicate balance of Earth. This possibility terrified Ea, for humans lacked both the knowledge to understand these devices and the wisdom to dismantle them safely. At the same time, humanity's growing scientific curiosity brought them dangerously close to uncovering these buried technologies. Excavations dug too deep. Explorations ventured into forbidden caves. Sailors charted coastlines above submerged structures. Miners stumbled into caverns filled with strange metals. In some cases, accidental discoveries triggered localized events, minor tremors, strange energies, or unexplained lights. These anomalies fueled rumors of gods awakening or ancient magic resurfacing. But the truth was far more complex. Earth itself was stirring, responding to forces older than recorded history. As the ninth turning matured, the lines between past and present blurred. Entire civilizations began referencing ancient prophecies in their political decisions. Scholars debated whether history moved in cycles or spirals. Priests performed rituals meant to stabilize cosmic forces they did not fully understand. Navigators tracked unusual star movements. Warriors claimed visions guiding them into battle. Poets spoke of ages ending and new worlds being born. And common people, though lacking formal knowledge, sensed a shift in the atmosphere, an unsettling pressure, like the world holding its breath. Ea concluded this chapter of his teachings by emphasizing a truth humanity needed to understand. Cycles do not determine destiny. They create conditions, but it is choice that shapes outcomes. The gods fell because they allowed pride to dominate wisdom. Civilizations fell because they clung to power rather than adapting. Now humanity faced its own test. The cycle would bring challenges, geological, spiritual, political, and cosmic, but whether humanity survived these challenges depended not on the heavens, but on their ability to learn, remember, and unify. For the cycle was nearing its peak. The world was shifting, The past was rising, and humanity, whether ready or not, stood at the edge of a transformation that would define the next age of Earth. In the darkness of his hidden chamber, the scribe carved Ea's final words for this turning with hands that shook from the weight of what he had heard. The 9th turning is the threshold. Those who cross it with wisdom will inherit the dawn. Those who cross it with pride will vanish into the ruins of forgotten ages. The final movement of the ancient narrative began not with a single event, but with a slow and silent unfolding. An awakening that spread across continents like a rising tide of memory. As the 9th turning reached its peak and the cosmic pressures mounted, humanity approached a threshold that Ea had long foreseen, a moment when the past, the present, and the future would converge, revealing truths hidden beneath layers of myth, symbolism, and forgotten history. The 10th turning was not a climax in the dramatic sense. It was a revelation, a lifting of the veil that had concealed the deeper architecture of the world for thousands of years. And as the scribe recorded, it was a time when humanity would be forced to confront the origins of its own existence, the fragility of its place in the cosmos, and the possibilities that awaited beyond the storm. At the dawn of this turning, the signs were everywhere, though most people did not recognize them. The skies shifted subtly, with constellations appearing brighter or dimmer than usual. The moon displayed unusual halos. The sun emitted strange flares that disrupted early instruments used to measure time and seasons. Animals displayed patterns unlike anything recorded in recent memory. Some migrated toward ancient sites, as if drawn by instincts passed down from a world older than humans. Others fled regions that would soon face upheaval. Earth itself vibrated with a deep, resonant hum that only the most sensitive could hear, an echo of cosmic forces stirring beneath the crust, awakening dormant energies long considered myth. Humanity, increasingly aware that something profound was happening, responded with a mix of fear, curiosity, and determination. Scholars across civilizations re-examined ancient texts, discovering references to cycles, alignments, and upheavals that mirrored the signs now unfolding. Priests, mystics, and prophets spoke of a coming transformation that would reshape the world. Some declared it a return of the gods. Others proclaimed it a judgment. Still others insisted it was a natural part of Earth's rhythm. But none understood the full picture. They saw fragments of truth, reflections in mirrors cracked by time. What distinguished the 10th turning from earlier cycles was the surge of rediscovery that swept the world. Ruins long ignored were excavated. Scrolls hidden in caves or buried beneath collapsed temples resurfaced. Forgotten languages were deciphered. Astronomers recorded patterns in planetary motion that hinted at a greater celestial structure. Explorers reached lands previously unknown, finding evidence of ancient cultures that had risen and vanished before their own histories began. Everywhere, the invisible threads connecting civilizations across time became visible. Myths that once seemed unrelated began aligning like pieces of a cosmic puzzle. Ea explained to the scribe that this alignment was not coincidence. It was the resurfacing of a truth buried deep in humanity's collective memory, that Earth had been shaped, guided, and transformed not only by natural forces, but by beings who once walked among mortals. The Anunnaki, though absent in the physical sense, had left behind imprints in DNA, in stone, in myth, in intuition. And during the 10th turning, these imprints awakened. people across the world began sensing connections they could not explain. Dreams became vivid and prophetic. Visions appeared to those with hybrid ancestry. Inventors discovered ideas that seemed to arise from nowhere. Artists painted scenes of ancient cities and celestial landscapes they had never studied. Children spoke of memories they could not possibly have lived. The veil between ages thinned. This thinning also revealed dangers. As the cosmic pressures peaked, forces buried beneath Earth's crust began to reactivate. Some were natural: tectonic shifts, volcanic eruptions, changes in ocean currents. Others were remnants of ancient technologies buried by the gods after the Great Flood. Devices designed to regulate climate, energy, or communication reacted to subtle changes in magnetic fields. Some flickered to life, emitting pulses of energy that caused strange phenomena: lights in the sky, temporary disruptions in weather, tremors in regions once stable. While these events fascinated some, they horrified others who interpreted them as supernatural warnings. Humanity stood divided. Empires already weakened by centuries of conflict now faced internal strife as populations demanded explanations for the strange events unfolding. Rulers struggled to maintain order. Priests argued over interpretations. Scholars split into factions, some insisting the changes were scientific, others claiming divine intervention. Meanwhile, the people felt caught between fear of the unknown and hope that the changes might reveal long-sought meaning. Ea told the scribe that the greatest challenge of the 10th turning was not the cosmic forces themselves, but humanity's reaction to them. Fear could lead to chaos. Fascination could lead to reckless experimentation. Dogma could lead to suppression of truth. Only wisdom, rare, fragile, and often ignored, could guide humanity safely through the transformation. As the cycle intensified, a new phenomenon emerged. Groups across the world began forming alliances to understand the ancient past. These alliances were unlike earlier cults or priesthoods. They were composed of scholars, navigators, astronomers, builders, mystics, and visionaries who recognized that the old divisions between nations and beliefs no longer mattered. They sought patterns, not dogma; knowledge, not power; collaboration, not conquest. They traveled across continents to share discoveries, decode symbols, and study ruins. They compared myths from different cultures, finding uncanny similarities in stories of floods, sky beings, cataclysms, and cycles of creation and destruction. Together, they reconstructed a rough outline of the cosmic timeline, a timeline that mirrored Ea's teachings with surprising accuracy. They realized that humanity was much older than their recorded histories suggested. They understood that civilizations had risen and fallen repeatedly, each shaped by cosmic cycles. They recognized that the gods of myth were not mere metaphors, but beings whose presence left imprints across the world. And they came to the unsettling conclusion that the 10th turning might bring a transformation equal in magnitude to the ancient flood. But unlike earlier ages, humanity was not helpless. They had knowledge, fragmented, incomplete, but powerful. They had tools, primitive compared to the gods' technology, but innovative. They had memory, imperfect but awakening. And they had a choice. Ea emphasized that this choice was the defining feature of humanity's evolution. The gods had shaped humanity to endure, adapt, and eventually surpass their creators. But surpassing required wisdom. The alliances began preparing, They studied the stars with new urgency. They built observatories atop mountains, deserts, and islands. They created maps that charted celestial motions for centuries to come. They developed early scientific methods to test theories. They recorded oral histories before they could be lost. They preserved knowledge in structures designed to withstand catastrophe. They trained apprentices to carry their work forward, and in secret gatherings, far from the reach of empires, they discussed the possibility that humanity was on the brink of becoming something new, something neither fully mortal nor divine. Meanwhile, fragments of the gods' legacy continued to awaken. In one region, an ancient device buried beneath a collapsed ziggurat emitted pulses of light that illuminated the night sky for miles. In another, a chamber sealed beneath a desert temple opened due to shifty sands, revealing inscriptions that described the gods' departure and warnings about the cosmic cycle. In yet another place, explorers found a cavern filled with crystals that resonated with strange frequencies, producing sounds that seemed to carry meaning. These discoveries fueled excitement and fear in equal measure. The last surviving gods observed these developments from afar. Their reactions varied. Some were moved by humanity's determination and ingenuity. Others were troubled by how closely humans were approaching knowledge once reserved for divine beings. A few still clung to old ambitions, wondering whether they might reclaim influence in the new age. But Ea remained steadfast. He refused to intervene directly. He believed humanity must walk through the turning on its own feet, guided only by the wisdom they had earned through struggle and memory. The most profound shift occurred when humanity began understanding the nature of cycles not as punishment or prophecy, but as opportunities for renewal. They realized that collapse and rebirth were not signs of divine anger, but expressions of cosmic rhythm. They saw that each age carried lessons forward, like sediment layered beneath rivers. They recognized that the 10th turning, though tumultuous, offered a chance to break free from the patterns that had dominated earlier eras. But breaking patterns requires confronting truth, and truth is rarely gentle. As the cosmic cycle reached its peak, Earth experienced dramatic upheavals. Coastal regions flooded as sea levels shifted. Mountains trembled under tectonic strain. Volcanoes erupted, sending ash into the atmosphere. Winds changed direction. Rivers carved new paths. Crops failed in some regions and flourished in others. Animals migrated en masse. Cities were abandoned. Populations scattered. And through these changes, humanity faced its greatest test. Yet amidst the chaos, something extraordinary happened. Instead of collapsing entirely, humanity adapted. Communities relocated and rebuilt. Scholars preserved knowledge even during flight. Leaders emerged who prioritized cooperation over conquest. Mystics offered guidance rooted in both memory and intuition. Engineers devised solutions that mitigated the effects of upheaval. The alliances forged during the early 10th turning proved invaluable, connecting distant populations and preventing total fragmentation. And then, in the midst of this transformation, the final revelation occurred. Not through cataclysm, but through insight. The alliances, after decades of study, deciphered an inscription found deep within an ancient site that predated the flood. The inscription described the purpose of humanity as the gods had originally intended, and how that purpose had changed over time. It revealed that humanity was not created to serve, but to evolve. Not to worship, but to understand. not to repeat the cycles of the gods, but to transcend them. The inscription spoke of a future age when humans would step beyond Earth and explore the cosmos, guided not by divine rulers but by their own wisdom. It confirmed Ea's teachings that humanity was designed to inherit the stars. This revelation spread slowly at first, whispered among scholars, then shared among communities displaced by the upheavals. It inspired hope in a time of uncertainty. It reminded people that the chaos of the 10th turning was not an ending but a beginning, and it unified them in a way no empire, religion, or army ever had. As the cycle gradually waned, Earth stabilized. Seas receded slightly, volcanoes quieted, weather patterns normalized. Populations settled in new regions, civilizations began to rebuild. Not as replicas of old empires, but as new societies shaped by lessons learned during the turning. These new societies placed greater emphasis on knowledge, cooperation, and preservation. They built libraries in remote locations, far from centers of power. They recorded their histories with honesty. They constructed structures aligned not with divine symbols, but with celestial rhythms understood through study. And they preserved the memory of the cycle so that future generations would not forget. Ea told the scribe that this moment, the stabilization following the 10th turning, marked the birth of a new epoch. Humanity had crossed the threshold. They had endured the storm. They had integrated fragments of the ancient past with new understanding. And though they did not yet grasp the full truth of their origins, they now possessed the foundation needed to discover it on their own. The scribe carved Ea's final message with solemn clarity, that the story of the gods and humanity was not a closed book, but a living narrative continuing into the future, that the past must be preserved not as myth, but as memory, that wisdom must guide progress, that cycles must be respected, that unity is stronger than fear, and that humanity's destiny extends far beyond Earth, for the age of gods had ended, the age of humans had begun, and the stars, once symbols of unreachable realms, were now invitations, beckoning the children of Earth to rise, explore, and fulfill the potential written into their very being. The turning was complete, but the journey had only just begun.